Picture this, you're 22 years old, in the prime of your life, with a pregnant and devoted wife you haven't been married to for very long. And then everything changes one night when a man is murdered in the street. You are accused of the murder, with the evidence being that it was your face a witness saw running from the scene of the crime. That evidence is weak, to say the least. And seeing as you know very well you didn't do it, you're confident you'll get off. But that's not the case, and you will spend many years behind bars. A trial judge will say you're likely innocent some 20 years after the crime was committed, and you still won't get out. How could this happen? Let's start from the beginning. The man we're talking about is named Benjamin Spencer, and he was convicted along with another man of committing a murder on a quiet street in West Dallas over 30 years ago. On March 22nd in the year of 1987, a 33-year-old named Jeffrey Young, who was doing well for himself at a clothing company, was attacked after walking out of his company office around 9:30 p.m. The police report says he was then manhandled into his BMW by two men and drove over to West Dallas, and it's there his body was dumped down a dark alley. Police thought they had gotten lucky when witnesses came forward and said that they saw what happened. There were 3 of those witnesses, and they identified 2 men. One was Spencer and the other was named Robert Mitchell. But as the district attorney of Dallas now says, something might have been amiss because all the witnesses all knew Spencer. These people were not strangers. Spencer was by no means an angel. He'd spent some time behind bars before for driving on a suspended license and had also been put on probation for 6 years for driving a car that had been stolen by a friend. Nonetheless, as we said, his new wife was pregnant and he was turning over a new leaf. After he was picked up 4 days after the crime, he wasn't very worried. It was just a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. But that wasn't the case at all. Spencer had an alibi too, which was the testimony of a young woman friend of his who said she'd been hanging out with him when the murder and robbery took place. On top of that, there was no physical evidence linking Spencer to the crime, just those witness testimonies. During the robbery, a watch had been stolen, as well as a wedding ring, a small portable TV, and a briefcase. None of these things were found at Spencer's house. Police didn't have any fingerprint evidence, nor was there a murder weapon found. Many years later, Spencer would say in an interview, "I began to think, well, I didn't commit this offense, the truth is going to come out." But a few months down the line, Spencer was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with the evidence being the witness's testimony as well as a jailhouse informant's testimony. It was a nightmare come true. Spencer's heart sank. His life was ruined. The father-to-be had become a condemned man, and the state had failed to do its job in his eyes. But not long into his sentence, Spencer got a break. It turned out that the star witness in his case had lied. She'd not told the truth about whether she had received a reward for coming forward and giving evidence. A new trial was set, but Spencer was then offered a plea deal by the state. He could probably get out in 5 years if he accepted this. But wasn't this 5 years too much? And why would an innocent man taint his name by admitting he killed someone when he hadn't? In his mind, he'd been wronged, and accepting a plea deal was just another wrong in the topsy-turvy world of American justice. Nonetheless, his attorney told him to take it. Years later, Spencer would tell NPR, he was saying, if you take it to trial, they're going to give you a life sentence, and they're likely to get it. And I'm like, I'm not going to plead guilty to something I didn't do. Who in their right mind would? And so he didn't accept the deal. During his second trial, the state prosecuted Spencer for aggravated robbery and asked for a life sentence. The evidence again was a witness testimony, with the star witness being a 42-year-old woman who lived close to the alley where the victim was dumped. It was her testimony that got Spencer convicted again. And as you'll soon find out, her testimony was hardly concrete, but she stood her ground and, according to reports, was very convincing when she described what she had seen on the night of the crime. This was Spencer and Mitchell dumping the body. Mitchell was also convicted again, and unfortunately he would not live much longer anyway. So now Spencer is back in prison again, looking down a long road of 30-something years living life behind bars as an innocent man. His life now would be dedicated to proving his innocence, and this would be a long process. Spencer got in touch with organizations that helped wrongly convicted men who were serving time. One such organization was named Centurion Ministries, and the people there knew that the state had sent down an innocent man. They built a case, interviewed over 100 people, and then asked for a hearing. The petition ended up on the desk of a criminal court judge in Dallas named Rick Magnus. He said he wasn't sure at first whether to have a hearing, mostly because the exoneration wasn't based on any kind of new DNA evidence. This is often what gets innocent people freed. But he later said in interviews that the more he read about the case, he realized there had been a lot of wrongs in Spencer's conviction. 20 years after the crime, Magnus granted an evidentiary hearing. The witnesses came forward again, and this time 2 of them backed down. But that woman who lived across from the alley didn't. She stood firm again. She said she had definitely seen Spencer. As we said, there was a big problem with her testimony. That's because all those years later, a forensic visual scientist was asked to watch a reenactment of the body being dumped. What that was people in the dark pretending to be the pair that dumped the body. After this, there was no doubt that this woman could have seen anything other than a silhouette. No way she could have clearly seen a face as she said she had done. That forensic scientist said with the conditions as they were, a person could not have made out a face any farther than 25 feet away. But as it stood, the witness claiming to have seen the man who was standing closest to the crime scene was 93 feet away. Again, just no way could any of those witnesses have got a clear ID. With this new evidence, Judge Magnus said, okay, enough is enough, and he ordered a retrial on the grounds of something called actual innocence. As for Spencer, he said he was over the moon when he heard the news. Not only would he get out, but he would clear his name too. In an interview, he said, I was very hopeful. I thought that this is it, I'm going home. That didn't happen though. Spencer said at first he was hopeful that his retrial would take place within a few weeks. They passed, so then he thought maybe a few months, and they passed. In fact, years passed, and the only authority capable of granting a new trial, the Court of Criminal Appeals, it seems, did nothing at all. Then in 2011, Spencer got some bad news. There would be no retrial. While a judge said that indeed if the new evidence had been presented at the first trial, it would have been unlikely that Spencer would have been convicted. But that same judge said because Spencer hadn't come up with any incontrovertible new evidence proving he wasn't there that night, such as CCTV footage or DNA that had never been tested, there would be no trial. The judge admitted that Spencer was likely innocent, but it didn't matter. He didn't have the evidence to get that new trial. His attorney now says that she needs to start again. She needs to find this new evidence proving her client's innocence. The problem, of course, is how do you find new evidence 28 years after the fact? The woman across from the alley now won't talk openly about the case. Another witness died, and another now says that she didn't get a clear look at Spencer. The witness now says he felt pressured by the police to say it was Spencer. So that's it. The only thing saying Spencer is guilty is the testimony of a witness who it's been proven couldn't have possibly seen Spencer that night. Everyone seems to know the case stinks, but the fact is the justice system doesn't seem to provide any solutions to get Spencer out. But there's more. There was another witness, but this witness was never called. She now says that she is 1000% sure that the people she saw didn't include Spencer. What about that jailhouse informant? Well, he now says that Spencer never told him he had committed the crime. Records also show something very fishy. The informant said in court that he had not received any benefit from giving that statement. But this guy was looking at a 25-year sentence for aggravated robbery. Guess what happened after he spoke to the police and gave his testimony? He walked out of prison after just more than a year. Another person has come forward saying he knows who killed the man that night because it was a friend of his who did it. He admitted it to him. This man did not come forward at the time because he didn't want to rat on one of his friends. The man whose name was put forward is currently serving time for robbery and assault. Investigators now say that police weren't going after Spencer, but they just had a case of what's called tunnel vision. They had a theory and they looked only at the evidence that fit that theory. Anything else was ignored. Spencer now sits in his cell, a man in his 50s wearing glasses, waiting and hoping, but he doesn't have too much hope left. In an interview, he said, "I'm just at a point where I'm still hopeful, but at the same time, it's like I'm stuck in the system." His story has been written about extensively in the American media, but it seems this man really is stuck in the system. He's been denied parole on each occasion he was up for it, and from what we can see, still waits in his cell to this day, waiting in vain for something to help him get him out of the web of American justice. If you've already seen the 2008 movie Bronson, about Britain's so-called most notorious prisoner, don't worry. That rather theatrical piece of cinema didn't tell you much about the man, so there's so much more to see today. You might be thinking that it's coincidental that a man with such a reputation has the same name as a former Hollywood tough guy, but he wasn't called that at birth. The name was acquired during his bare-knuckle boxing days. He was actually born Michael Gordon Peterson. Yep, that doesn't sound quite as fearful. There's a lot of controversy about this man, regarding whether he should have been in prison for so long or if prison is to blame for his often crazy behavior. We discuss this and more in this episode of The Infographic Show, Britain's most notorious prisoner, Charles Bronson. As you know, he was born with the name Michael. His birthday was December 6, 1952. He spent his first few years in Wales and then moved to Luton, which isn't too far away from the capital, London. It doesn't seem that he came from a rough-and-tumble background, given that his father ran a conservative club for a while and his aunt and uncle were a mayor and mayoress. His aunt actually once said this about him: "As a boy, he was a lovely lad. He was obviously bright and always good with children. He was gentle and mild-mannered, never a bully. He would defend the weak. He might have defended the weak, but it seems his penchant for violence and crime started early in life. After he moved up north at the age of 13, it seems that that's when trouble started. At that age, he was charged as a juvenile for stealing, and it said he was part of a gang. He didn't much enjoy school and soon left to start working at an early age. His first job came when he moved back down to Luton. This was a very short 2-week stint working in Tesco supermarket. Apparently, he was fired for attacking his manager. After this, it seems, crime became second nature to young Michael. He got in trouble for criminal damage but got off with a fine and some probation. He had lots of jobs, mostly related to labor or factory work, and we're told he enjoyed nothing more than a good night out on the town, drinking gallons of beer and getting into fistfights with the locals. Easy to do in some areas of the UK. He likely wasn't short of foes on the mean streets of Luton. One of his jobs, we're told, was a circus strongman, so he was likely a hard man to fight. He got in trouble again after crashing a stolen lorry, or a truck, into another car, but again got off with just a fine as no one was seriously hurt. At this point, he is still in his teens. Yet again, he got into trouble, and at this time aged 19, when he was involved in a smash and grab, which is basically smashing a car into a shop front and getting as much as you can. Again, he got off with just a fine and a suspended sentence. Age 20 perhaps, he got his chance to join what is sometimes called the straight and narrow, as he met a girl and got married. But apparently she quite liked his tough guy persona, his tailored suits, and the fact that he spoke in a Cockney accent. They had a child and called him Michael Jonathan Peterson. According to the British press, the son is very private and has never spoken publicly about his notorious dad, so we can't tell you much about him. Moving on, now 22, Michael was arrested for armed robbery, and at this time the judge came down hard. He got 7 years, but prison wasn't exactly a place he liked being, it seemed. During his first stint in prison in Liverpool, he attacked 2 other prisoners, and we're told he wasn't provoked. That got him time in solitary, something he would see much more of later. He was then transferred to prison in Hull, and again had issues with guards and prisoners. They gave him sedatives to calm him down, which apparently made him very ill. He also spent more time in isolation. He was said to be a very difficult prisoner. On one occasion, he was out of solitary, he attacked a prisoner with a glass jug, and he was convicted of unlawful wounding. Yet again, he was moved, this time to the tough Armley jail in Leeds, a foreboding-looking place if you've ever seen one. So there he was, now serving time in what looks like a medieval castle. Even in 2018, the place is said to be the place with the highest rate of people taking their own lives. And in the press right now, it's said it's still very much an unsafe place for both prisoners and staff. Back in the 70s, it can't have been a holiday. But it seems he was too much for Armley, and he kept moving between a number of prisons, sometimes chained to the floor of the vans he traveled in. It's said if not in solitary, he would attack prisoners and guards. It's also said he incurred numerous vicious beatings from the guards after an attack. You might have seen that in the movie, which depicts these guards having to tackle him in numbers. During one time in solitary while recovering from a beating, he got divorced. We imagine this might have been a low point, but it's said that one thing that kept him going was his solitary workout routine, keeping him healthy and fearsome. His book, Solitary Fitness, which he wrote after many years inside, has sold millions of copies. Reviews are actually very positive, although people talk about how strange the book can get at times. Profits from the book, says the media, go to children's charities. The British press tells us that his strength was quite unbelievable. He once bent the cell bars with his own hands, and it's said he holds 6 world records for strength and fitness. Another unofficial record he has set is the most prison rooftop protests by any British inmates. But right now, we're still in the 70s and a long way from fame or infamy. While in prison in London, he tried to poison an inmate, and it seems that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Enough with prison, he was transferred to a psychiatric facility. But guess who he met there? 2 of Britain's most ruthless gangsters, the Kray twins. He called them the best 2 guys I ever met. That friendship didn't last long though, as he was moved back to prison. What followed was more solitary, escape attempts, attacks on prisoners that ended with lifelong scars, more attacks, and finally, when the authorities were sick and tired, he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He was no longer just a criminal, but mentally ill. In 1978, he was again in another special facility, but it seems he didn't much like being forced to take medication, and wasn't keen on the fact that he was surrounded by some of Britain's most disturbed people. Men who would never leave the facility because they had done things to people we will not talk about. Yep, he didn't like some of these terrible men, and at one point was said to be about 5 seconds away from killing a fellow patient or prisoner who had taken the life of an innocent child. In his own words, describing the people around him at the facility, "I witnessed them running into walls, using their heads as rams. I've seen them fall unconscious doing this. There was one who just kept trying to eat himself, biting his arms, legs, and feet. He tried to kill another prisoner, and then in 1982, when still in the notorious Broadmoor, he led a rooftop protest that lasted 3 days and caused around $300,000 worth of damage. Now you can see why this guy became well known as a hard-to-deal-with prisoner. But there was a lot more to come. He hadn't even started. He led 2 more rooftop protests and also went on a hunger strike, but in some ways he found solace in writing poems, sketching, and creating cartoon strips. He even won awards for his work. It didn't stop him being violent though, just settled him down from time to time. Psychiatrists couldn't figure him out, and even though he was in a mental facility, he was never properly diagnosed. He once said, "Asylums are crazy places with crazy rules. If you're not mad when you arrive, you are when you leave." Again, he was moved from facility to prison, stabbing inmates, hitting others. More rooftop protests, more isolation, more beatings from the guards, more medicine, and perhaps his piece de resistance, he once strangled a prison governor. After that, he was not allowed out of isolation until he finished his sentence. He got out of prison in 1987 and almost immediately turned to crime. Although his first offense was quite comical, he bought a water pistol and modified it a bit, after which he forced a man at Water Pistol Point to drive him to Luton, his favorite spot. There, he started bare-knuckle fighting and earned the nickname Charles Bronson. He actually legally changed his name to this. Was this the start of a life on the outside? Not a chance. It's written that he would fight anyone and even challenged the king of bare-knuckle fighting, Lenny McLean. It seems Lenny wanted no part of him, or at least when he agreed to fight, it was too late as Bronson was back in prison. In another fight, he was challenged to go against a large Rottweiler. He killed it and said later in life that he really regretted that. It was cash in hand though. He was only out of prison months and was back inside again for armed robbery. We won't go into details, but he fought again, attacked prisoners, guards, and had more time in solitary, was moved and moved and moved, and occasionally tried to start riots. In 1989, he was attacked himself, stabbed in the back several times, but he recovered. He wouldn't tell the police anything about his attackers. In 1992, he got out for the grand total of 53 days. He was jailed but got off. Then he was arrested again for having a shotgun and conspiracy to rob. It gets crazy here, because while on the remand, he took a librarian as a hostage. While negotiating with police, he had 3 demands: an inflatable doll, a helicopter, and a cup of tea. Yep, you heard that right. He was given 8 years despite saying the gun was to blow off his own head. It wasn't the first time he had contemplated taking his own life. He was difficult again, transferred from prisons, and at times was left naked for many days on end in dark isolation. At one point, he was put in the worst spot in any prison in the UK, something called the Hannibal Cage, that had been created for another prisoner who had once killed inmates and was said to have spooned out one person's brain and eaten it. Even though at one point he attacked a governor, it's said he got much better after being allowed to interact with handicapped children. He also kept up his cartoon sketching. These were the quiet times. They didn't last long. He endured more solitary, more moves, and then in one prison he took 2 Iraqi hijackers as hostage in his cell. It's said he was going crazy after losing his father. It's also said that he told the guards if they came close he would snap off the heads of his hostages. He made his hostages tickle his feet and demanded they sing songs to him. To them, he was known as the General. He demanded a plane, machine guns, ammunition, and a cheese and pickle sandwich. It seems later he just kept asking for ice cream. In the end, he let the hostages go and another 7 years were added to his sentence. While in great physical shape, it's said that all the time in darkness and solitary had negative effects on his eyes and his social skills, and lawyers now started to get on his side. It's a pity then that he took one of them hostage. He let him go quickly though, but after one civilian worker criticized his drawings, he took him hostage too, and then started ripping up parts of the prison. What else? Well, after the millennium, he got married again, converted to Islam, changed his name and took another hostage, wrote a book, sketched a lot, and then changed his name to Charles Arthur Charlie Salvador, out of respect for his favorite artist. The movie came out and he became a household name. Until then, not many people knew about him. Thousands of people around the world started to support him, saying even though he had been a bad boy, his incarceration had just gone on too long. But he couldn't stop messing up. In 2014, he attacked another governor. That same year, his artwork went up for auction, and his 200 pieces, often dark in nature, fetched around £30,000. Bronson donated a large part of this to the brain tumor charity and Keach Hospice in Luton. Bronson said the old him was now dead, and he was born again as the artist Salvador. He created more works too, donating to other charities and one-time Oxford's homeless. He also got married to an actress in 2017, and she's hoping to see him out soon. In total, out of the 44-plus years he served, 36 of them have been in solitary confinement, sometimes without light. In 2018, it was said that he is in open prison, but will have his case reviewed in 2 years and could get out. That might not happen though, as he's got a life sentence for one of his kidnappings. That was a teacher in 1999 that he held for 2 days. The British media reports that he allegedly smothered himself in butter, age 65, and challenged the guards to a fight. We'll leave you with something he once said. "I'm a nice guy, but sometimes I lose all my senses and become nasty. That doesn't make me evil, just confused." Believe it or not, there's a fairly long list of people who have survived their executions. We might look at the case of William Duell, a 17-year-old English boy who was hanged in 1740 in London and then came back to life as he was about to be dissected. He was later exiled to North America. Then you had John Babacombe Lee, another Englishman nicknamed the man they couldn't hang, after surviving 3 executions. More recently, you have the case of Rommel Broom, an American man sentenced to death by lethal injection. He survived that, ended up writing a book called Survivor on Death Row, but it seems he spoke too early, as he's scheduled for another execution in 2020. But today we'll talk about one of the best-known survivor stories in this episode of the Infographic Show, Death Row inmate who survived his own execution. As we've said, a handful of people have survived their executions. You can read quite recent cases too, such as American inmate Doyle Lee Ham, who was said to have experienced torturous and traumatic hours in the execution chamber before staff admitted that they had failed. The U.S. media reported in 2017 that a man called Alva Campbell became the 3rd man to survive an execution in the country in recent decades, and that was just a matter of the execution team not being able to find a vein in which to inject the lethal drugs. But perhaps the tale we're about to tell you now is the most moving, as the person that survived was only 17 years old. It's also the first case of someone surviving the electric chair in the USA. If you've seen our show on Old Sparky, you'll know that executions in the early days could certainly be horrific to watch, but eventually the inmates succumbed to the shock. That was not the case for 17-year-old Willie Francis. Let's have a look at what events led to him ending up in the chair. Francis was a young, poor African-American in 1946, and at the time of his lucky escape, many people believed that the hand of God had interrupted this macabre spectacle of official murder. For one thing, he was just so young, and a lot of people decreed the execution of a boy not yet a man. And another thing was the fact that the American justice system at the time could have been said to be harsh for certain people of certain races and certain social standing. He lived in a place called St. Martinville, located in southwestern Louisiana. You can read articles about this place in the 40s, with one saying that the town had 2 sections, one for the white people and the other for the colored. The white tended to their own business and the colored tended to theirs. Yes, this was a time when racism was pervasive in some parts of the US, and despite the backwards attitudes of some people, there was a lot of support for young Willie when he was condemned to death. After the botched execution attempt, Francis wrote from his prison cell, "A lot of people write me to ask me to tell them something about what I did when I was young. I'm only 18 now, so I guess they mean when I was very young. But what had he done?" One of 13 children, Francis said life was hard as a kid, but he wrote he had fond memories of the hard-knock life, playing baseball with a broomstick handle, and going out with friends causing mischief. When he got older, he was given a job by a man called Andrew Thomas. Thomas owned the local drugstore, hiring Francis to do errands and keep the store tidy. They apparently got along, and Francis was called a nice boy and cooperative by folks who visited the store. He was, however, called illiterate by some, or at least close to that. Others said he was slow, but later when Francis was writing from his prison cell, it was proven that he could not just write, but express himself in a deep and meaningful way. We're telling you this because this case was very controversial, and at the time and for years after, people tried to understand why this seemingly nice kid committed a murder. That murder was of the drugstore owner, Thomas. When her son was convicted of slaying his boss, the mother told the press, "There wasn't no bad in him, I just don't understand." Quite a few people thought that this young boy, perhaps somewhat mentally challenged, had admitted guilt to something he didn't do, the murder of Andrew Thomas. Described as a handsome, educated bachelor with his own successful business, he was killed at his home during that night of November 7, 1944. His body was discovered the next day, splayed on the floor near the house steps. Two witnesses, Alvin and Ida Van Brocklin, had said that they heard gunshots in the night. They didn't see who did the firing though. It was later said that Thomas had been dining with friends and upon returning home had been met by a gunman who unloaded 5 bullets in him. 2 hit him in the back, 2 in his left side, and 1 went right through his eye. It said his pockets had been emptied, prompting police to say the reason for the murder was robbery. Rumors spread around town. It said he was quite the ladies' man, and many speculated he had been killed by one of those ladies' husbands or lovers. For months, people believed this to be the case. Sometime later, police were looking for a drug dealer, and it said that Willie Francis just happened to see the police. He wasn't dealing drugs, but it said that when he saw the 2 white police officers running his way, he just took off out of fright. That was a mistake, as running made the police think that he was guilty of something. Later, Francis was interviewed by cops at the police station. They said he seemed frightened and he stuttered a lot, but it turned out that Francis had stuttered his whole life. The cops didn't think that they had captured a drug dealer that they had been looking for, but guess what they found on Francis? They found Andrew Thomas's wallet and identification card. That's what they said anyway. It said that within 3 to 5 minutes, the police got a full confession for the murder of Thomas. They also managed to get a confession for an unrelated assault and robbery in another town. The facts cops did this in a few minutes, and the fact that the boy was said to be somewhat slow would compel people to ask if the interrogation and subsequent confessions were perhaps a part of a setup. Francis was questioned without a lawyer, without any advice, without any family member or friend being present. The confession read, "I, Willie Francis, now 16 years old, I stole the gun from Mr. Ogassie at St. Martinville, Louisiana, and kill Andrew Thomas November 9th, 1944, or about that time at St. Martinville, Louisiana. It was a secret about me and him. I took a black purse with card 1280182 in it, $4 in it." He wrote a second confession the next day. This one contained more details about how many shots had been fired and where the body was found. As for the trial, it said Francis's lawyers were inept. One writer says they never questioned for indictment, nor did they make a motion for change of venue, despite the widespread publicity about the murder of a beloved white member of a small community by a black youth. The 12 white jurors found him guilty, and he was to be executed. Francis' lawyers never challenged the verdict. By the way, Francis has pleaded not guilty. The jury never heard any argument pertaining to the possibility of a forced confession or that evidence could have been planted. The confession itself was good enough for him to be convicted. Many people in the town thought that something smelled funny, as did many others across the U.S. The local press wrote, quote, "Throughout the trial, the Negro was uninterested and showed very little emotion," unquote. Francis wrote that he was concerned that he might act like a crybaby on the day of his execution, but was relieved to hear that the actual execution would only tickle. On May 3, 1946, he had his head shaved and prepared to have 2,500 volts of electricity flow through him. On his cell wall, it was discovered that he had written the words, "Of course I am not a killer." Police never did have a motive for the murder, nor any substantial evidence other than the confession of a slow 16-year-old boy. He was taken to Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola to be put in the chair nicknamed Gruesome Gertie. The lever was pulled, and this is how Francis later described the feeling. "I couldn't stop the jumping. If that was tickling, it sure was a funny kind. I thought for a minute I was going to knock the chair over. Then I was all right. I thought I was dead." Other reports state that he shouted, take it off," as the executioners tried to give him a second round of shocks. It's said that after the failed attempt, he wasn't even injured, but he said he felt kind of dizzy. Some people said this was a miracle and a righteous one, as they didn't believe that he was guilty nor had a fair trial. Louisiana's Governor James Davis then said in 6 days they would send him to the chair again. That didn't happen, and much of America got behind the young man. He once wrote, "I felt just like a movie star. I didn't have any idea I had so many friends." He also later described how his execution felt and something he called the chair. He wrote, "You feel like you got a mouthful of cold peanut butter, and you see little blue and pink and green speckles, the kind that shines in a rooster's tail." What ensued were many months of legal arguments. Not only did some people believe he wasn't even, but lawyers now argued that to subject a person to a second execution was cruel and unusual punishment. Prosecution lawyers argued against that, stating the first attempt had not worked worked at all and he had not been hurt, but the evidence supporting this in hindsight seems pretty weak. The court also heard that the botch was just an accident, and such accidents happen for which no man is to blame. That meant no one was at fault, and there should be another execution. We might also note that later the state was petitioned, with lawyers stating this about the botched execution. The scene was a disgraceful and inhuman exhibition, that as soon as the switch controlling the current was taken off, the drunken executioner cursed Francis and told him he would be back to finish electrocuting him, and if the electricity did not kill him, he would kill him with a rock. The drunken men in charge that night were accused of being sadistic, not giving Francis the full shock because they wanted to torture him. He was then returned to the chair on May 9, 1947, and this time he didn't survive. He was just 18 years old. If anything positive came out of all of this, it's the fact that the justice system was exposed for not supporting Francis in the first place. This poor black boy may or may not have killed his boss, but he certainly wasn't protected as he should have been by the American justice system. Many Americans of all colors saw and criticized what had happened.
The thought of prison is enough to keep them on the straight and narrow. But for others, prison is merely a consequence of their chosen lifestyle. And for a select few, prison is nothing more than a challenge, a puzzle begging to be solved. Today, we'll look at some of the more creative escapes in this episode of the infographic show, The Greatest Prison Escapes in History. We're starting off with a classic, fictionalized by Hollywood into the film The Great Escape starring Steve McQueen, though the real story is fraught with far more drama than what could fit on the silver screen. In World War II, the prisoner of war camp known as Stalag Luft III was thought to be the most secure POW camp in Europe. Hundreds of miles southeast of Berlin, it was located deep in enemy territory and featured a host of security features meant to make it difficult to escape from. Along with barbed wire fences, the Germans had sunk microphones 9 feet deep into the soil all along the perimeter in order to detect the sound of digging. The prisoners' huts were all built on stilts, raised up above the ground so any tunnel would be immediately visible. Lastly, the sandy soil made it nearly impossible to dig through, threatening collapse at any moment. Yet none of these things stopped a band of British, Canadian, Australian, French, and American airmen from attempting an escape anyways. The plan was to build 3 tunnels codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. Using only metal silverware and milk tin cans, the prisoners painstakingly chipped away at the building support columns of 3 different huts in order to avoid being seen working underneath them. They accessed their below-floor workspace via a secret trapdoor over which they kept a heating stove permanently lit in order to discourage any Nazi guards from getting too close. In order to solve the microphone problem, the escapees dug their tunnels a whopping 30 feet deep, excavating an astonishing 100 tons of sand, all by hand. To avoid raising suspicion, the excavated sand was concealed in stuffed socks which they would sprinkle discreetly on garden soil being raked by other prisoners. To shore up their tunnel walls, the prisoners stripped 4,000 wooden bedboards and then lined each tunnel with 1,700 blankets to muffle the sounds of digging. They converted discarded milk tins into lamps with wicks made from pajama cords, and burned in mutton fat the prisoners skimmed off the greasy soup they were served. Stealing a few hundred feet of electrical wire, the prisoners even managed to fashion their own work lights, which they plugged directly into the camp's electrical supply. And if that's not enough ingenuity, the prisoners also created an air pump using hockey sticks and other discarded bits of trash, and even built an underground trolley system to transport the excavated sand. On March 24, 1944, the prisoners finally made their escape. Forced to move one by one through the cramped tunnels, barely a dozen managed to make it out per hour, and at one point, a 1-hour blackout during an air raid further slowed the escape attempt. At around 5 a.m., however, disaster struck, with a Nazi guard on patrol nearly falling into the exit shaft of one of the 3 tunnels and discovering the plot. A massive manhunt was mobilized, and eventually the Germans recovered 73 of the 76 escapees. 3, however, would make it to safety. 2 Norwegians, who stowed away on a freighter to Sweden, and a Dutchman who made his way to Gibraltar by rail and foot. A furious Hitler ordered the execution of 50 of the escapees, violating the Geneva Convention. Years after the war, a military tribunal found 18 Nazi soldiers guilty of war crimes for shooting the recaptured POWs, and 13 of them were executed. As one of the largest manhunts in American history, the prison escape of the Texas 7 in December of 2000 made headlines around the world. On December 13, 2000, the 7 inmates convinced a maintenance supervisor to let them skip lunch so they could wax the floors of the maintenance room. Distracting the supervisor, one of the inmates knocked him unconscious with a blow to the back of the head, then undressed him, tied him up, and locked him in an electrical room. During this time, 3 other inmates, 4 prison guards, and 9 supervisors wandered into the room, and incredibly, all were subdued by the inmates. That's when the Texas 7 put their plan into action. By impersonating various supervisors over the telephone, the inmates got out of 12 head counts, and then making their way to the gatehouse, incredibly conned their way inside by pretending to be monitor installers. Once inside the gatehouse, the prisoners subdued the lone guard and got his firearm along with a few other weapons from a weapons cache. Then the prisoners opened the back gate and drove their way out in a stolen pickup truck, launching a multi-state manhunt that would be one of the largest in American history. Eventually found, thanks in part to the television program America's Most Wanted, the prisoners even demanded a TV appearance before they would agree to surrender. In the end, no such appearance would be granted, and all of the 7 were brought back into custody. There's never been a more iconic prison in history than Alcatraz, and naturally it is the setting for our greatest prison escape story. A lifelong criminal, Frank Morris was serving a 10-year stint for bank robbery when he broke out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, only to be recaptured a year later and sent to Alcatraz. Ranked in the top 2% of the population in intelligence and with an IQ of 133, Morris paid no heed to Alcatraz's reputation as an inescapable prison and quickly went to work developing an escape plan. Partnering with brothers John and Clarence Anglin and car thief Alan West, the 4 prisoners discovered an unguarded utility corridor that ran just behind their cells, which housed a ventilation shaft to the roof. Utilizing scavenged saw blades, spoons stolen from the commissary, and even a home-built drill made from the motor of a broken vacuum cleaner, the 4 gradually widened the ventilation duct opening in each of their cells. The holes were concealed using cardboard and paint, and Morris's accordion provided cover for the sound of their work. Once inside the utility corridor, the 4 climbed to the roof of their cell block and set up a small workshop there. Using stolen and donated materials, the 4 made makeshift life preservers using 50 raincoats from a design they had seen in an issue of Popular Mechanics. They also used the raincoats to create a 6 by 14-foot rubber raft and used a small accordion-like concertina they stole from another inmate as a bellows to inflate the raft. Their paddles were made from scrap wood and stolen screws. On the night of June 11, 1962, the men began their escape. Of the 4, though, Alan West was unable to leave his cell, having used cement to shore up the crumbling concrete around the vent opening in his cell, which threatened to give him away. Once dried, the cement narrowed the escape hole and fixed the steel grill in place, and by the time he had re-widened his hole and removed the grill, the others had already left without him. The other 3 inmates climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof, then hauled their homemade life preservers and raft 50 feet down a kitchen vent pipe to the ground, and then scaled 2 12-foot barbed wire fences. Somewhere along the northeast shoreline of Alcatraz, where the prison's network of searchlights and gun towers had a blind spot, the men inflated their raft and then rode into the dense fog, trying to reach Angel Island 2 miles to the north. In the ensuing manhunt, police would recover one of the paddles and bits of raft and life preservers, but no sign of the men. With their stated plan having been to steal clothing in a car and no vehicle or clothing thefts reported in the area after the escape, the police finally concluded that in all likelihood, the men drowned in the strong currents and frigid waters of San Francisco Bay.
You would think that when strapped to a gurney, knowing the life force in you is about to expire, you'd want to say something nice to someone, or profound, or perhaps apologize to the family of the victim that's watching your demise. Then again, if you were an innocent person about to have his veins filled with a lethal cocktail, you might not be in the mood to deliver a tender speech. You might also be a ruthless and heartless psychopath that wants to fill the air one last time with your monstrous voice. As you'll now find out, that has happened, and it might send shivers down your spine hearing what they said. First up, Richard Aaron Cobb. Cobb was executed by lethal injection in 2013 in Texas. His crime was walking into a convenience store with an accomplice and robbing it. It didn't stop there. They took 2 female employees and 1 male customer and forced them into a car. They took them to a secluded place and shot them execution style, and then drove away thinking they were all dead. Only the man actually died. His last words were very strange, starting out nihilistic. He then finished with something very surprising. I hope that someday this absurdity that humanity has come to will come to an end. and then seconds later after he started to pass away. Wow, this is great. Thank you, Warden. This next one is slightly more gruesome. John Wayne Gacy. You all know the story of this man, and we won't go into detail about what he did. He murdered 33 people in the 70s and hid many of the bodies under his house. He is one of the USA's worst serial killers. His last words show that he had no remorse whatsoever. They were, "Kiss my..." We can't say that last word, otherwise the video will get demonetized. But we are sure you can guess what it is. There's no cursing in this next one, but we think you'll agree it's pretty darn dark. Peter Kürten. You've never heard of this guy, we bet. He was a German serial killer at a time where there were few of them about in Germany. That was the early 20th century. He killed at least 9 people and did terrible things with the bodies. One other thing was that he drank the blood of his victims, and that's why he was sometimes named the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In 1931, he was beheaded by guillotine, and just before that happened, he looked at his psychiatrist and said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Before the blade came down, the psychiatrist replied, "No." Eileen Wuornos. This woman you might have seen portrayed in a Hollywood movie called Monster. She worked selling her body on the streets and killed 6 of her male customers. She claimed she was defending herself, but that didn't hold up in court. She's now known as one of America's worst female serial killers. She was executed in 2002, and just before that, she promised she'd come back to life again. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Sticking with serial murderers, this next monster fits the bill. Carl Panzram. This guy was a serial killer in the US at the start of the 20th century. He committed murders among many other despicable things. He said he had killed 22 people in all. He was sentenced to be hanged in 1930, and just before the executioner put the cover on his head, he spat in his face. He was asked if he had any last words. This is how he replied. "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." In case you're wondering, a Hoosier is someone from the state of Indiana. Up next is arguably the funniest on this list, James French. French killed 2 people in the late 50s and mid-60s in the USA. One of those people was his cellmate. The two didn't get along very well. His actual last words when sitting in the electric chair were, "There's nothing else to say." But the last thing he said to a reporter was this: "If I were covering my execution, do you know what I'd say in the newspaper headline tomorrow?" The reporter said, "What?" He answered, "French fries." Yep, that was amusing. We think this next guy was also attempting to make a joke. Jeffrey Matthews. Matthews shot and killed his uncle during a robbery, and he was executed in 2011 in Oklahoma because of that. His last words aren't exactly frightening, but his dark sense of humor at the end is perhaps a little bit shocking. He said a few things, but his very last words were, "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." Robert Charles Comer. You can say the same about this man. At the end, he either had a twisted sense of humor or was on another planet, mentally speaking. In 1987, he killed a man, but he'd also committed some other serious crimes throughout his life. When he asked if he wanted to say something at the end, he said, "Go Raiders." That's in reference to an American football team. Such a statement, you might assume, encapsulates how little he thought about himself and life and his victims. Robert Alton Harris. Alton was executed in California in 1992 for multiple murders. He'd been a career criminal with a long rap sheet, although his killing of 2 boys is why he got the gas chamber. He was incredibly heartless if you read his story, but we won't go into it today. At the end, he became poetic, his last words being, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." He's not wrong about that. He's not as amusing as the next person, though. Vincent Gutierrez. This guy was executed in Texas in 2007 after being found guilty of killing a man. Gutierrez had been trying to steal the man's car and then shot him in the back. He was under the age of 18 when it happened. He said a few things for his last words and apologized for what he had done. But then he finished it off by saying, "Where's my stunt double when you need one?" John William Rook. Rook believed his difficult childhood was the reason he committed a murder in 1980 in the US. He had 12 hot dogs for his last meal. And then, just before they took his life away, he thanked them and said, "Freedom, freedom at last." James W. Rogers. Rogers was sentenced to death after killing a fellow worker at a uranium mine in 1957. The two had fallen out over quite a big issue, and that was how a scoop shovel should be properly greased. They didn't see eye to eye regarding the grease, and Rogers shot the other man. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. When Rogers was ready to have the firing squad finish his life, He was asked if he had any final words. His reply was, "I done told you my last request, a bulletproof vest." Charlie Livingston. In 1983, this man shot and killed a woman in Houston during a robbery. He didn't seem to see the point of final words when the time came, and he made that point, saying, "You all brought me here to be executed, not to make a speech. That's it." That was simple enough, quite different from what's coming up. Douglas Roberts. This man from Texas was quite the opposite, and he had quite a lot to say on the day of his execution by lethal injection in 2005. He'd been found guilty of kidnapping, robbery, and murder. When the time came for his last words, he said, "I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. Before I leave, I want to tell you all, when I die, bury me deep, lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm dead." The media later reported that he was upbeat and animated before his execution. Frederick Wood. Wood was another joker, albeit with a dark sense of humor. He was put to the electric chair in 1963 for the crime of murder. When asked what his final words would be, he replied, "Gents, this is an educational project. You're about to witness the damaging effect electricity has on wood." The next couple of people you could say are unique on this list. Mary Blandy. Now we're going really back in time, and this is the story of an English woman whose father didn't approve of her relationship. She looked to poison to deal with this problem. She was hanged in 1752, and at the time she was wearing a dress. She was worried people might look up the dress, even though it wouldn't matter much after she was dead. Still, she told the executioner, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, don't hang me high." Sarah Good. Now we go even farther back to the Salem trials in Massachusetts in 1692. Good was in her 30s when she was accused of being a witch and then sentenced to death. All 12 jurors agreed that she had to be a witch. She was accused of lacking in self-discipline and being a servant of the devil. She had only challenged locals regarding their very strict Puritan values, but they had said that made her in league with Satan. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes was there at the end and still tried to get her to confess, and she of course refused. Her last words were, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." 25 years later, Noyes had an aneurysm, and as the story goes, he coughed up blood and choked on it. We should say this is what's called popular legend. But as the witch trials were so terrible, we imagine many people might hope it happened. While these witch trials were madness to the highest degree, Mary's husband at least sued the courts for what's happened to her, and he won. Now we go back to the present day and a couple of guys that look death straight in the eye. Clarence Ray Allen. This man was executed in California for killing 3 people. He was executed in 2006 when he was the ripe old age of 76. He was very sick at the time, and a lot of people wondered why the death sentence, since it seemed he didn't have much time left anyway. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die." Melvin White. White had committed the terrible crime of murdering a child, and he was executed in Texas in 2005. We won't go into the details, but what he did shocked a lot of people. Not many folks felt sorry for this man as he went to the gurney for his dose of lethal drugs. He did say he was sorry for what he did and then said, "All right, Warden, let's give them what they want." The next couple of people you might say didn't sit too well in their chair of death. Tory Twain McNabb. In 2017, this man was given lethal injection in the state of Alabama. He'd been convicted of killing a police officer. He and his lawyers had tried to stop it going through by saying the punishment was cruel and unusual, but that didn't work. He went to the gurney an angry man, and with both his hands, he pointed 2 middle fingers in the air. He then said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I'm unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." Thomas J. Grasso. We have perhaps saved the strangest last words to last. And this was the execution of a man that had been convicted of 2 murders of elderly women. He was given lethal injection in the state of Oklahoma in 1995. He wrote a short poem before his death, and part of it went like this: "The warden will read my last creed, and the deadly brew will flow, as the poison drips into my veins, and from my body life does drain." But his last words were in the form of a very practical complaint. We guess he was being ironic. Those words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." There seems to be some disagreement as to who has spent the most time in solitary confinement. But you can find a handful of people that did over 40 years without much contact with other people. The record might well be smashed by the British prisoner called Robert Maudsley, aka the Brain Eater, or the real-life Hannibal the Cannibal, who's now done over 40 years in solitary. The man we're going to talk about today might be behind in terms of years spent kept away from the other prison population, but there's another reason he's called the most isolated prisoner in the world. Mr. Silverstein, who was born in 1952, has been in prison since 1977. Back then, he was convicted of armed robbery and sent to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas to do his time. You might be curious why armed robbery with no deaths would warrant such a long sentence, but it's what Tommy did inside the prison that made the difference. He has been given the epithet America's most dangerous prisoner, and while the media is prone to exaggeration at times, he certainly has been very dangerous within the confines of U.S. prisons. During his time behind bars, he's been convicted of killing 4 people, although one of those convictions was overturned. For that, he was later given a specially designed solitary cell, and one that he would have to spend 24 hours a day in 7 days a week. According to blog posts written not long before we started writing this show, Silverstein had some very serious health complications, but we're told that the Bureau of Prisons will not release any information as to his condition. He was put into intensive care, although we're told not even his family were allowed to visit him. This is how isolated this prisoner is, and we should add that by the time you watch this show, there might not even be a Tommy Silverstein. But now let's look at how he got into this point in his life. We're told that Tommy grew up in Long Beach, California. While pregnant with him, his mother got a divorce, though she then married again. Silverstein claims that the second man is his real father. He wasn't around that long anyway because his mother divorced again and married a Mr. Silverstein, and this man legally adopted the young Tommy. From what we can see, he didn't exactly come from the wrong side of the tracks. It's said he lived a middle-class kind of life, but was very shy and certainly not a tough kid at the start. He was bullied for various reasons, but it's written that because of his name, the other kids used to pick on him for being Jewish in a neighborhood where there weren't many Jewish people. It's said he soon toughened up and fought back, with Silverstein saying his mother didn't suffer fools or bullies gladly. Most bio websites post this comment that Silverstein once made about his childhood. "That's how my mom was. She stood her mud. If someone came at you with a bat, you got your bat and you both went at it." So it seems he was a slightly troubled kid, but he didn't get into serious trouble until he was 19 years old. That's when he was arrested for armed robbery the first time. He was sent to San Quentin and served 4 years. Not long after getting out, he met his father, the real one that he says is his biological father, and also his uncle. The 3 were eventually arrested for 3 armed robberies. It seemed Silverstein, being so young, garnered some sympathy, with those people saying the young man had been taken in by the older men. The judge wasn't buying any of that lack of parental guidance stuff though, and sentenced Tommy to 15 years. He wouldn't get out of prison again and might never if his present sickness gets the better of him. Even if he survives that, it's very unlikely he'll ever get out of prison again. It's said his release date is officially 2095. So if he makes it to 143, he might feel the wind on his back again. While in prison in Kansas, he developed a friendship with members of the Aryan Brotherhood. In 1980, Tommy, now 28, was convicted of killing a fellow inmate. The story goes that the inmate had turned down an offer he couldn't refuse. That was to be a drug mule for the white gang. This is what the TV show Crime Investigation had to say. As an inductee of the Aryan Brotherhood, Terrible Tom happily committed acts of violence, which soon escalated to murder. He violently killed DC Black's gang member Danny Atwell. We should say, though, that his conviction was overturned, with some of the witnesses later charged with lying in court. Silverstein was then sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which was said to be a very tough prison. Silverstein had been given a life sentence for that murder, but obviously that had been reversed after the perjury charge. But then he was accused of killing another DC Blacks member, Robert Chappelle. Silverstein always denied this, and then the Bureau of Prisons did something one could call worthy of redress. They moved the nationwide leader of the DC Blacks, Raymond Cadillac Smith, to Marion while Silverstein was on trial for Chappelle's murder. "I tried to tell Cadillac that I didn't kill Chappelle, but he didn't believe me and he bragged that he was going to kill me," Silverstein would later say. He added that no one tried to keep the men apart, and it was believed by him and the other prisoners that the guards wanted one of the men to kill the other. A more cynical person would say that the system wanted one less violent inmate. The one less they eventually got was Cadillac, who was stabbed 67 times by Silverstein. He did this with another member of the Aryan Brotherhood called Clayton Fountain. Crime Investigation writes that Silverstein walked up and down the wing with the dead body to show the others what might happen if they decided to try and take him out. We're told after this he became one of the top guys in the Aryan Brotherhood. He was also given another life sentence. So now we bring in an officer called Merle Eugene Klutz. He was supposed to maintain order in the violent wing of the prison, but Silverstein has always maintained that Klutz came in with a very heavy hand. He was there to especially watch Silverstein, and the latter said that he didn't only watch him, but regularly tormented him. That culminated with the death of Klutz. One day in 1983, he and other guards were taking Silverstein to the shower block. On the way, with the help of another prisoner, Silverstein got out of his handcuffs with a homemade key and stabbed the officer with a shank or a homemade weapon that he'd been handed. The autopsy report revealed that Silverstein stabbed Klutz around 40 times. Silverstein has always said he did this because Klutz had treated him particularly badly, even for prison. An investigation revealed that wasn't the case, but Silverstein said the investigation itself was corrupt. He was transferred to a different prison at this time, where he murdered another guard. What followed was a 23-year lockdown at Marion. Some say these two incidents were the reason the first Supermax prison was built in the US. You might guess that this was the beginning of Silverstein's days in solitary. It wasn't normal solitary though. It was what's called total isolation. That means 24 hours a day in the cell and lights are on all the time. His security status was no human contact. Not many prisoners get this, with Silverstein and the British maniac we mentioned at the start of the show being the most notorious. Advocates of human rights have said such isolation is not far from a torture technique used by the military and sometimes extremists called whitewashing. Gradually, the BOP started giving Silverstein books and a TV. But skeptics say this only happened because the Bureau realized that in order to really punish someone in prison, the prisoner can't just have nothing. You need to give him something and then take it away. This is the Torture 101 style we see in the movies, such as Silence of the Lambs when Dr. Lecter has his books taken away. We should add that his self-contained cell is a bit bigger than usual cells. For one thing, it has to have a shower as he can't go to the shower room. We've seen plenty of sketches online that Tommy himself drew of his cell. We might also add that Silverstein didn't hate all guards. In a now famous case, one part of a prison was overtaken by Cuban rioters in 1987. Silverstein was let out of his cell, and he could go anywhere he liked for a short time. The Cubans held guards hostage, and so the authorities were concerned that Silverstein would hurt or even kill them. One of the guards had known Silverstein for a long time, but no bad came to him. It said he had always been kind to the prisoner, asking him on occasions if his handcuffs were too tight. Still, Silverstein said some of the guards would torment him often. In fact, you can read a blog that includes a note written by Silverstein that must have been written just before he fell ill. There he talks about deprivation, saying, "Dear friends and supporters, as I've noted for decades with each new warden administration, that they rotate every 3 years or so, usually takes away from what we've got instead of gives us more." He adds, "They gotta flex their muscles as cowards do with the hopeless and helpless." In the last paragraph, he talks about what his solitary confinement is like, saying, "Like the monotone bars and walls that entomb me, they've stamped out the colors of happiness that I enjoy sharing with the outside world, enforcing a black and white existence in this colorless hole of madness." Other blog posts written by friends of Silverstein tell us that his writing and art have been confiscated at times, and getting anything creative out of prison has been hard. We found a lot more of Tommy's thoughts that have been published on blogs. He writes in other posts that, unlike even the worst case of confinement, he can't even shout across a corridor. His isolation is what you might call extreme solitude. He writes that things have happened to him that have never been reported, and he adds that inside the prison walls things go on that seldom make it onto those prison TV shows. For him, the penal system is unjust. The prison system in general is not about rehabilitation for the most part, he believes. As for solitary, he writes, "History and studies clearly show that solitary confinement does more harm than good, that it reveals the idiocy and sadistic mentality of prison administrators who embrace this barbaric medieval practice, and that it is a crime against humanity." The guards didn't see it that way, with one prison official once telling an author, "We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life a living hell. Otherwise, inmates will kill guards too. There has to be some supreme punishment." We should add that Silverstein does get to visit people now and again, but never in close quarters and always with glass and a telephone. One visitor recently wrote, he was told there were certain things he was not allowed to discuss with me, one being the book he is writing. Tom talked about his desire to further his education. I had no idea there's no longer funding for prisoners to study. Prison. The final frontier, for some, a place where they end their days. Others will get to leave, but they'd wish they'd never stepped foot inside. Here are 50 things nobody tells you about prison. Number 50. We'll start with the USA, the country that can claim to lock more of its citizens up than any other, and by a long way too. According to 2020 data, there were 2.3 million US citizens behind bars. But when we say bars, that includes federal and state prisons, jails, juvenile correctional facilities, and immigration detention facilities. Just so you know, these numbers are not exactly stable, but close. People enter and leave facilities all the time. Number 49. It works out to around 639 people behind bars for every 100,000 people. The US is still number 1 in per capita terms. Here are the countries that follow up in the top 10. The number is per 100,000. El Salvador, 562. Turkmenistan, 552. Palau, 552. Rwanda, 511. Cuba, 510. Maldives, 449. Virgin Islands, UK, 447. Thailand, 443. The Bahamas, 442. Let's stick with numbers for now. We'll get around to the messed up stories soon. We promise. Number 48. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, in the U.S., 600,000 people enter prison every year, but that's nothing compared to jail. Around 10.6 million Americans enter jail every year. If you're wondering why that number is so high, it's because many people get out of jail very quickly once they've got bail. Some of them already have been convicted for small crimes, so stay there for a while. They number around 160,000 people a year. 1/4 of people who go to jail will be there again after release within a year. Another reason for staying in jail is the simple fact that many poor people can't afford to make bail. In 2019, the Chicago Tribune wrote that of the 5,736 inmates in Cook County Jail, 5,390 were waiting for a trial. Half of them couldn't afford to pay bail, or they didn't have a place to stay where they could be electronically monitored. That begs the question, how many are innocent? Number 47. It's hard to say because statisticians tell us that a person is 9 times more likely to say they are guilty of a misdemeanor crime if they can't make bail. They just want to move things on, even if they're innocent. In fact, 95% of cases never go to trial. People take plea bargains, sometimes if they're innocent. That doesn't mean prisons are teeming with innocent people, but quite a few people have been wrongly convicted of a crime. The Innocence Project says it's between 2.3% and 5% of prisoners in the U.S. Other sources put it as high as 10%. But why? Number 46. The answer is for many reasons. Some innocent people take a plea, especially if they think they have a less than great lawyer and they've been convinced that if the case goes to trial, they're looking at a hefty prison sentence. In court, an innocent person could lose because of prosecutorial misconduct, or because a witness lied, or even a cop lied. Maybe during the interrogation, the police were somewhat heavy-handed and the victim was overwhelmed. Let's now look at an extreme case when this happened. Number 45. We've picked on the US enough for now, so now we'll sail across the pond to the UK. In 1974, a 17-year-old council worker named Stephen Downing confessed to murdering a 32-year-old woman named Wendy Sewell. The case would become known as the greatest miscarriage of justice the UK had ever seen, although that's questionable given witches were burned there. Anyway, this young lad first told cops he found the woman at the cemetery where he was working as a groundskeeper. He said he moved her body and that's why he got blood on him. He was interrogated for 9 long hours. He also had learning difficulties, and there wasn't any lawyer with him during the questioning. Guess what? At the end of the grueling interrogation, he'd said he'd done it. He was given a long sentence with the condition that he could meet with a parole board after 10 years. Inmates believed this guy had hurt a woman, so he was beaten badly and he had to change prisons 8 times. Later, he was caught in something called the innocent prisoner's dilemma. He couldn't be paroled because he refused to say he committed the crime. Talk about a catch-22. It's actually not that uncommon. We won't get too much into it, but the whole case was shambles. He should have never been sent to prison. The cops knew this. One journalist that tried to help Downing told the BBC that the police harassed him. He said, "They made my life absolute hell for 5 or 6 years. I was pulled over for speeding, stopped and searched, victimized. I was very worried for my family." Downing got out after 27 years, and subsequent investigations found that the police in the past had done some very sketchy work indeed. On release, he received around $1 million in compensation and became a chef. He told the press, "I never allowed myself to feel angry or bitter. Who could I have taken it out on anyway? I still refuse to." Number 44. The vast majority of prisoners in the U.S. are not in for violent offenses. We looked at the latest 2021 data from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons and saw that 46.2% of prisoners were in for drug offenses. No other crime came close. although offenses relating to weapons, explosives, and arson accounted for 20.2% of prisoners. Every 25 seconds, someone is arrested for drug possession in the US, although they don't all end in prison, of course. Number 43. We looked into drug possession offenses, and it is a very contentious issue. One reason is that drugs are widely available in prisons. In fact, there are reports stating that people have gone in for possessing soft drugs and got addicted to hard drugs inside to deal with the mental issues they faced. The vast majority of prisoners in for drugs are not trafficking drug kingpins, they're merely addicts. Research shows that importers or high-level suppliers only amount to 11% of drug offenders doing hard time. On top of that, there's ample data to suggest that more poor people get stopped by cops and more of them go to prison for drug offenses than middle-class or wealthy people. As the Marshall Project said, rich drug abusers go to treatment, not prison. The UK Guardian echoed that, saying, "The wealthy make mistakes, the poor go to jail." The story said you're much more likely to have a drug problem if you've suffered trauma growing up or grown up poor. Prison is like a double whammy. Pew Research said this: more imprisonment does not reduce state drug problems. Pew discovered that the deterrent of prison hasn't and doesn't stop people from taking drugs. This is why this is one very big hot potato of a subject. Okay, enough of that. Who served the most time ever? Number 42. We found a few names. Paul Geidel served 68 years in the US after being convicted of second-degree murder in 1911. Weird thing is, it's looking like a parole board might have released him in 1926 because of his good behavior, but then he was found to be legally insane. He could have gotten out after 63 years, but by then he was so institutionalized that he chose to stay in another 5 years. He died a free man in 1987, age 93. Number 41. Francis Clifford Smith served over 71 years in prison for the murder of a night watchman in 1950 in Connecticut. In 2020, he was moved to a nursing home. Now you'll see how innocent men can spend many years behind bars. Number 40. In 1972, age 26, Richard Phillips went to prison an innocent man. He was released 46 years later. He wrote this poem a few years into his incarceration. Ain't it a crime, when you don't have a dime, to buy back the freedom you've lost? Ain't it odd that when you pray to God, your prayers don't seem to be heard? Ain't it sad when you've never had the freedom of a soaring bird? He was finally exonerated in 2018 and later told he received $1.5 million in compensation. He told the media, "I just want to keep a low profile, travel, and enjoy life. That's what I've wanted to do in the first place." Number 39. In a paper titled Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it was said that 4% of people in the US on death row are probably innocent in the past and right now. Number 38. 18 people in the US have gotten off death row after DNA testing proved that they were innocent. They had collectively served 229 years. Sometimes innocent people get executed too, as you'll now see. Number 37. A U.S. man named Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in 2004, and later his innocence was proved after the case was said to have been heavily flawed. His last words were, "The only statement I want to make is that I'm an innocent man, convicted of a crime I did not commit." This is what an investigator later said. The whole case was based on the purest form of junk science. Johnny Garrett was executed in the US in 1992, and later DNA evidence proved he was innocent. It said he didn't want to share any last words, although some sources say he said, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss my..." We omitted one word. When innocent Florida man Jesse DeFaro was executed in 1990, Old Sparky malfunctioned, and witnesses said what they saw was pure horror. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel wrote, "Flames and smoke erupted from his head." Now you'll see that executions of innocent people don't only happen in the USA. Number 36. In Russia in 1983, a man named Alexander Kravchenko was executed for murder. Turns out that the killer was none other than the butcher of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo. In 1950, a man named George Kelly was hanged in the UK for murder. There had been unbelievable police corruption in the case. The cops basically set him up. In fact, police had the confession of another man, but since they'd made a mess of the case, they held that information back. In 1989, a man named Tang Jingxiang was executed in China for the murder of a woman. That woman later turned up to the surprise of everyone. Jingxiang had committed no crime at all. Number 35. Prisoners get drunk while locked up on alcohol they make themselves. It's sometimes called hooch or pruno, or prison wine. The best brewers can earn okay money from selling it. One former prisoner said you can sell half a gallon of wine for $25. Each pant leg makes 2.5 gallons, so you do the math. It's a good hustle. He said he cut pant legs and sewed the bottoms and lined them with plastic bags. Then he filled them with water. After that, he threw in 5 pounds of sugar, loaded diced tomatoes, and tomato paste. He then let that all ferment. Other prisoners have used bread for yeast. As for the sweetness, any kind of fruit works, but you can also add candy. It's important to burp the bag. We saw a guy in a podcast who said he'd forgotten to do that, and he got covered in the stuff when it exploded. Number 34. Another thing prisoners will pay good money for is mobile phones. It's not easy getting them in. Sometimes an officer can be tempted with cash or even threatened. Other times the phones are plugged in the rear, which you can imagine can be quite uncomfortable. For a run-of-the-mill phone, you might be able to charge $1,000 US inside prison. Number 33. In 2015, Brazilian prison officers discovered a unique way prisoners were getting phones inside. They used cats. One cat that frequently went in and out of the prison was found with 4 mobile phones, 4 chargers, and 7 cards attached to it. Number 32. Just how much a man can plug is anyone's guess, but we saw a documentary where an officer showed how a prisoner had plugged a foldable knife. The British Prime Minister was recently given a lesson on such acts when he learned some British prisoners were hiding Kinder eggs in themselves filled with drugs. Number 31. Why would people go to such an effort, you might ask? The answer is the markup. Drugs in prison are way more expensive than on the outside. So much so, officers might sometimes get in on the dealing. It's a license to print money, and there's no shortage of prisoners wanting something to take the monotony away. In fact, because opiates can't be detected in urine around 2 to 3 days later, some prisoners get into them even though they just wanted to smoke weed. Weed can be detected up to 21 days after ingestion. One podcast we watched said he took opiates in prison, but every so often he got caught out. He said then he went back to the first floor where he had no privileges. He'd slowly go back to the upper floor where he'd do more opiates, then he got caught again and was sent back down. He called it the merry-go-round. Number 30. Even tobacco is expensive inside. One prisoner said he was getting stuff brought in, and then he charged $2 or $3 for just one small rolled cigarette. That meant that one pouch cheap outside of prison was worth a lot of money. In 2020, in an Irish prison, officers discovered one haul that included mobile phones, 800 grams of weed, 2 grams of cocaine, and 10,000 pills. To give you an idea of how much that's worth, we'll go to another news story that said in the UK in just 2017, 15,000 phones and a massive 189 kilos of drugs were confiscated. A phone in a UK prison might go for $300 to $1,300, and those are low-quality devices. The same article said synthetic drug called Spice can cost over 30 times more in prison than on the outside. Cocaine, depending on the quality, might cost $100 on the outside for a gram. That might go for $1,000 on the inside. The markup was even higher for a gram of heroin. This is why some people put eggs in their behind. Number 29. Another way to get stuff in is when violent cons groom officers. That happened to a man named Lee Davies in England. He was on incredibly low pay for such a stressful job, and then he helped some gang members get phones and drugs inside. His money problems were over. He was told to wait in a car park someplace, then a car would pull up and throw something into his car. He then smuggled the package inside, and he kept doing that for months. He was eventually caught. He said later, "There's no excuse for what I did, but I have deep sympathy for people working in that environment." He believes he was partly groomed by the prisoners. Number 28. He started on £20,000 a year, or $27,000. That's a very low wage, but the job has got to be one of the hardest you could do. According to job websites, a starting prison officer's wage might be $31,740 a year in the US. Overstressed and underpaid is what you hear from most officers. They're dealing with violence and outrage, and sometimes severe mental issues, almost on a daily basis. Number 27. Then there's what's called the prison industrial complex. Mass incarceration has become a business, one that is booming in the U.S. The American Civil Liberties Union says mandatory minimum sentences helped create the U.S.'s bursting prisons. And on top of that, there was the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This led to more mass incarceration and massive profits for the private prison industry. There are many kinds of businesses that make money, not just private prisons. You have the food services, handcuff makers, clothes services, and the ones earning from cheap prison labor, and much more. This is how one person put it. The prison industrial complex is not only a set of interest groups and institutions, it's a state of mind. The lure of big money is corrupting the nation's criminal justice system, replacing notions of safety and public service with a drive for higher profits. Number 26. These are some companies benefiting, or that benefited from cheap prison labor in the U.S. McDonald's, Walmart, Microsoft, IBM, Target, Intel, Victoria's Secret, yeah, they make lingerie, Honda, Starbucks, Nike, Nintendo. Number 25. If you want to know how much the prisoners make, NPR interviewed a guy that worked at Omaha Correctional Center after getting 8 to 16 years for theft and forgery. He was paid $2.25 a day for a 12-hour shift, but he also said one phone call cost him $5 and a bag of chips also cost him $5. Number 24. For some regular prison work in some prisons, you get nothing. Just getting out of your cell is payment. Prison policy said in Florida, if you're laboring for state-owned industries, you can earn between 20 cents and 55 cents an hour. That seems to be about the going wage. Now for some more prison violence. Number 23. Not surprisingly, prisoners get killed in prison. Gang violence is usually to blame, or at times people are killed for a certain crime they committed on the outside, or someone just gets killed over an argument. In 2008, there were only 40 homicides in U.S. prisons. That number pretty much increased every year. In 2020, the last data we could find, the number was 120. As you'll now see, violence inside the prison is much worse in other countries. Number 22. We looked at prisons and jails in Ecuador and what's been going on in 2021. In February, the BBC reported that 79 people were murdered in 4 different Ecuadorian jails, although they were related to the same gang squabbles. In April, the BBC reported 5 men were murdered and 16 injured in just one Ecuadorian prison, again gang-related. In July, Al Jazeera wrote that 22 men were murdered and many others were injured in 2 prisons in that country. Gang rivalry was to blame, but overcrowding and bad conditions was also mentioned. After that, Ecuador's president declared a state of emergency. Number 21. Okay, so you've all seen the movies that suggest in some US prisons you have to join a gang or you'll either get beaten or exploited. Really, do convicted accountants end up putting in work for the Sureños? It's actually a complex question, but we guess the best people to answer it are folks who've done a lot of prison time. There's no shortage of those people, who now have their own YouTube channel. People say it depends on where you're doing your time, but it might not mean you have to get involved with a gang. Most prisoners give the advice, just keep your head down and do your time. They usually agree on one thing though, and that is you will likely at least need alliances. A British stockbroker agreed. He had the bad idea of starting an ecstasy empire after moving to the US. After being locked up in Arizona, he said the first thing that happened scared the hell out of him. Gang members came into his cell and asked for his papers. He didn't know what that meant. They actually wanted to see what he'd been convicted of to make sure he hadn't hurt society's most vulnerable. In some prisons, that could mean KOS or kill on sight. It's why some prisoners are housed in protective custody. After he was deemed okay, he said he didn't join a gang, but he also said he made some friends. That made his life much easier. One former prisoner in the US said this: "The commonly held belief that joining a gang is the only way to survive prison is one that I sincerely wish would forever go the way of the dodo. I honestly think it's the gangs themselves that try their hardest to propagate this false notion." Another guy agreed, but he said hanging with your own race in some prisons is a must. He also said this: "In the yard, all the races hang with their own. With the gangs and shot callers, they may take advantage of the weaker ones, making them pay rent and such. But once you stand up for yourself, they'll usually stop and often ask you to join the gang. If you say no, they usually accept it. So no, you won't have to join a gang, but as you'll now see, you also won't be completely independent." Number 20. There's the dining room or chow hall. If you don't get told where to sit by officers, you'll sit with your own race. This is where it helps to have made friends. You certainly have to show respect, so just plonking your behind down without thinking about it will lead to you getting a bust head. One prisoner said at his prison there was what he called short bus tables. These were the tables where anyone could sit, but he said they were reserved for the less respected prisoners. Most former prisoners agree on one thing: it's in the chow hall where you see alliances. Even if you're a fiercely independent person, some former prisoners say going it alone is not recommended. Number 19. In the UK, race doesn't matter all that much. You usually hook up with friends, and if you're a longtime criminal, you'll likely have some. If there are gang rivalries, it's not about the color of your skin, but where you come from. In London or Liverpool, there have been what the media called postcode wars. In some podcasts, former British prisoners from the South said they didn't like getting sent to the northern part of the country and vice versa. Number 18. If you do get attacked in prison, it's sometimes with a homemade knife or shiv. Sometimes it's just with a razor blade. Other times the instrument will have a few razor blades attached close to each other. This is so the wound is almost impossible to stitch. The British media has reported a lot on this. Apparently the wound leaves a really big scar. That's bad, but this is worse. Number 17. One of the most horrendous things prisoners do, and it seems it's not all that uncommon, is throw boiling water in someone's face. They'll usually fill the water with sugar because that makes the water caramelized and sticky. In the past, in the UK, this has been referred to as napalm. After that, you need some good advice. Number 16. Prisoners often talk about the prison code, which to be frank sounds hypocritical and nonsensical a lot of the time. Still, there are some do's and don'ts the prisoners talk about. Do: keep your head down. Be polite and respectful as much as possible. If you're picked on or attacked, fight back even if you're the lamest fighter in the world. Develop an exercise routine. Study the lay of the land. Educate yourself when something is available. Choose your friends carefully. Maintain good personal hygiene. Don't act tough. Now you're nobody. Gamble. Take drugs. Borrow stuff, even if someone seems really kind. Judge people. Steal. Stare. Talk to everyone about your crime. Fart, if you can help it. Snitch. Number 15. Sometimes inmates locked in their cells create what are called biological projectile weapons. These are to spray officers with urine, feces, or even bile. Just in California, at 3 prisons, there were 111 gassing attacks in 2017. In that state, you get 5 years in segregation for gassing an officer. Number 14. Prisoners sometimes use coded letters to get messages to each other, which might look innocuous, but if you can decode the message, something darker lurks between the words. In 2018, a letter sent from a prisoner to the outside that didn't say anything out of the ordinary was an order to kill a staff member in the Atlanta jail. You just had to read between the lines. Other times, prisoners create their own ciphers, with symbols designating a letter of the alphabet. A gang expert who specializes in breaking codes said about this, "Not knowing what a code says can give us nightmares. We need to know what these gang codes say, but sometimes we need to know what they don't say even more." Number 13. Perhaps one of the strangest things to happen in a woman's prison is someone gets pregnant when they have never had a conjugal visit, like a private visit with a lover or spouse. That happened in 2019. A woman had been behind bars for a year and a half, waiting to be sentenced for capital murder when she had a baby. She'd been charged with being the getaway driver when an elderly man was shot and killed. It later transpired that she'd somehow conspired to get pregnant by sleeping with a male inmate working at the prison. News reports said she hoped to having a new child would sway the judge to grant her some leniency. This next one is heartbreaking. Number 12. The youngest prisoner ever to sit on death row was George Julius Stinney Jr. This African-American boy was arrested in June 1944, charged with killing 2 people. In June, he was executed in the electric chair, and he was so small that a Bible had to be propped under him on the chair. The investigation was an absolute travesty of justice, and the jury that sentenced him was all white. The grave he was buried in was unmarked. In 2014, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project said this: "There is compelling evidence that George Stinney was innocent of the crimes for which he was executed in 1944. There wasn't any substantial evidence to support his guilt, and his defense lawyer was less than useless. In fact, he had no support at all. It was a kid against the racist cops and indeed the racist justice system. The real murderer of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames got away." His conviction was overturned in 2014. Number 11. The oldest person executed was Walter Moody. He died by lethal injection in Alabama in 2018. He'd been convicted of killing a judge with a mail bomb in 1989. Number 10. Prison is supposed to rehabilitate. That's why it's there. But often those that go in again. Officers sometimes call the prison gates a revolving door. It's hard to compare recidivism rates worldwide because you have to choose certain years to conduct the study, and there's a lot of data from all over the world. The U.S. National Institutes of Health did a study, but the data was from different years regarding different countries. Nonetheless, it found that the percentage of released prisoners that were arrested for another crime within 2 years in England and Wales was 48%. In France, it was 40%. In Finland, it was 36%. In Norway, it was 20%. In Australia, it was 53%. And in the U.S., it was 60%. Number 9. The U.S. Supreme Court in 2011 called California's recidivism rates stratospherically high. It was said then that a whopping 70% of released prisoners in that state were back behind bars within 3 years. The state's prisons were accused of not rehabilitating but producing additional criminal behavior. That's why prisons are sometimes called crime school. It's hard to fully understand why people end up back in prison, but parole violations and habitual drug use, as well as falling back into poverty and hopelessness, count for something. Critics have said U.S. and other countries' prisons focus a lot more on punishment rather than rehab, which is the opposite of the Norwegian model. As you know, that country has very low recidivism rates. Okay, we think you need to hear some good news. Well, it's kind of positive. Number 8. A British guy named Stephen Akpabio Clementowski was locked up in England in 2002. While serving his 16-year sentence for drugs offenses, he earned a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees. He had 0 qualifications when he went in and started with his GCSEs and A-levels. That's equivalent to junior and senior high school. He worked in the kitchens all day and studied on the toilet at night, where he said it was quiet. He told The Guardian, "Sometimes I wondered how I did it. The idea that you can study in an environment designed for punishment is ridiculous." He said it wasn't easy studying in what he described as a hellish place. "I still have nightmares 10 years after leaving. It's a really damaging environment," he said. He's now a lecturer and a regional manager and spends a lot of time going back into prisons to help prisoners. While he did well locked up, he's still very critical of British justice. He doesn't believe prison acts as a deterrent to crime. He said people aren't being deterred. The number of people in prison has increased by 69% over the last 30 years. They're not being rehabilitated. Number 7. Anthony Ray Hinton spent close to 3 decades in isolation on death row in Alabama. He was exonerated in 2015. He's since written an award-winning book, The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row, and was awarded an honorary degree. Now you'll hear about a man who's more locked up than anyone else. Number 6. The British man who spent the longest time in prison is Robert Maudsley. He's been locked away since 1974, but for the last 25 years, he's been in the worst prison cell in the whole of England. He killed 3 men while in prison, and one of those murders earned him the name the British Hannibal the Cannibal. It was a brutal murder, but not as bad as those British tabloids made it out to be. Now he's in a special cell which is underneath the prison. It has thick doors with bulletproof glass. Even when you open the doors, he's actually in a cage within the cell. He's allowed no contact at all with other prisoners. He gets out once a day for an hour, but has to have 6 guards around him at all times. They try not to make eye contact with him or speak to him. He once said, "I am left to stagnate, vegetate, and to regress, left to confront my solitary head-on with people who have eyes but don't see, and who have ears but don't hear, who have mouths but don't speak." Many people have called this inhumane. They know his story and feel sorry for him given his childhood and the nature of the offenses of the people he killed. We won't go into detail, but we think you can work it out. He's possibly the most locked up man in the world. He once said, "I feel like I'm buried alive." The prison wouldn't even allow him to have a pet budgie. Number 5. The polar opposite of this is Bolivia's San Pedro prison. It's more like a village than a prison. There are cells to rent, markets to shop in, and even tourists can visit. Prisoners make cash by selling cocaine paste to them. Wives and children can live with the prisoner. There's also a prison hotel, a soccer pitch, a few churches, and a hospital. Officers work there, but the prisoners themselves ensure bad things don't happen inside. If a prisoner does commit a crime, they are disciplined in, let's say, a very stern way. If they commit a very serious violent crime, they're likely dead soon after. Number 4. We think the biggest prison in the world has to be Turkey's Silivri prison. It spans over 250 acres and is home to more than 10,000 prisoners. Are Turkish prisons bad? Maybe they were in the 70s when hundreds of US citizens occupied them, mostly for smuggling that quality hashish they so loved. When Billy Hayes was a student, he was sent to one. He wrote a book on his release and it became the harrowing movie Midnight Express. He actually escaped in the end. He actually said the movie exaggerated a fair few things. The next country's prisons are bad, and no one denies it. Number 3. One prison with lots of Westerners serving hard time within its walls is Bangkok's Klong Prem prison. Many smugglers have lived there and felt what it's like to sleep with 60-odd men in a cell packed like sardines. One man actually holds a record there to this day. He's a British guy named David McMillan, a former big-time drug smuggler with a rather posh accent. He's the only Westerner ever to have escaped the prison. In prisons such as this, if you have money, you can live well. There's a kind of anarchy in there, and the guards take a piece of everything. McMillan had a personal cook, someone to do his laundry, and he had a cell with few people in it that had a TV. He even had a little office area. But when he heard he would be transferred to Bangkwang Central Prison, aka the Bangkok Hilton, he made a plan to escape. The Thais call this prison the Big Tiger because it eats men. Many that go in die there. McMillan successfully escaped, but the funny part is that once he got to the street, he opened an umbrella he'd taken with him. When asked why he did that, he said, "Escaping prisoners don't carry umbrellas." Number 2. One of the worst prison disasters we could find happened in the US at Ohio State Prison in 1930. There was a huge fire, except the guards wouldn't open the cell doors. One person described it like this: "There was nothing to do but scream for God to open the doors. And when the doors didn't open, all that was left was to stand still and let the fire burn the meat off and hope it wouldn't be too long about it." Some prisoners managed to overpower the guards, but outside those cells they were given orders to shoot and kill. One prisoner later said, "Naturally, all of those men were in there and hollering and screaming for help, and some of the men were praying, and some of them was cussing, and some of them were raving. It was a question to do what you could do to help them." 322 inmates died from the fire or smoke inhalation, and another 230 had to be hospitalized. Okay, let's finish on a positive note. Number 1. There's a prison in Finland called Suomenlinna Prison. The prison walls are actually just a small fence. In the past, it has had problems with prisoners not trying to break out, but people trying to sneak in. The cells are like nice dorm rooms, and the shared kitchens all have the modern appliances you can ask for. Some prisoners are in there for the most serious offenses, but they go to this prison when their term is close to an end. It's kind of like finishing school, the halfway house before prisoners enter society at large. Still, they do their last few years there even though they could easily just walk out. Why, might you wonder? A prison official said this: "The main idea here is to prepare the inmates for release into the community. It doesn't make sense for an inmate to be in a closed prison for say 6 years and to suddenly enter civilian life. We also offer rehabilitation for people who have had problems related to alcohol, drugs, or mental illness." Imagine a man trapped in a room that's 2 paces across and 4 paces long. His bed is a concrete slab with a small rubber mattress and a thin blanket. His desk has only a concrete stool, and no matter where in this tiny room he lingers, his toilet is never further than a few feet away. He hasn't seen the sun in weeks, and when he's allowed outside, he is quickly shuttled to a caged-in area that is just 4 paces across and 8 paces long. Inside is a deflated soccer ball and nothing more. This man is only allowed to write to or receive mail from a very restricted list of individuals, and any outgoing letters undergo intense scrutiny and censorship, taking up to 3 months to be delivered. A reply letter undergoes the same process, and if not rejected outright, will take another 3 months before the man can read it. You're just imagining this cruelty, but for many, it's a daily reality that they have lived in for years. Welcome to H Unit at Colorado's Federal Supermax Prison, otherwise known as Hell on Earth. Isolation, solitary, or special housing units have been a punitive measure employed by prisons for centuries. While in the past a prisoner may have been thrown into solitary on a whim, today in our modern prison system it's supposed to be used only as a punishment for prison offenders or for the safety of individuals who may be at risk within the general population. Though solitary is meant to punish bad behavior and ostensibly to correct it, psychological studies dating back over the last 150 years have consistently shown that solitary confinement is extremely psychologically harmful. Individuals kept in solitary for long amounts of time can develop a form of PTSD and can become extremely averse to loud noises or bright lights. They exhibit extreme antisocial behaviors, which can be counterintuitive when the goal of the incarceration is to correct bad behavior. Instead of teaching an inmate a lesson, solitary confinement can in fact make an inmate even more dangerous and aggressive. In one famous case, an inmate released straight from isolation into parole at the end of his sentence murdered Colorado Department of Corrections Executive Director Tom Clements. The inmate had spent years in solitary confinement, getting only an hour of exercise a day if the staff allowed it, which they often did not, in an outdoors cage where he remained, you guessed it, alone. Then one day he was a free man and promptly took revenge for his treatment. Solitary had turned a dangerous man even more dangerous and had clearly failed its intended purpose. Crime must be punished. That's a basic tenet of any nation which operates under the rule of law. But where is the line drawn between punishment and torture? Many Americans today, on both the left and right of the political spectrum, agree that solitary confinement for extreme lengths of time is inhumane, and the data clearly shows that it's counterproductive to rehabilitation. Yet it remains a popular punishment at many modern prisons. Think back to the man at the start of the show. He lives in a cell that is 2 paces across and 4 paces long, sleeps on a concrete slab, has only a concrete stool to sit on, and lives and eats with his open-faced toilet always within arm's reach. He hasn't been allowed to send or receive mail in months, and on average might look forward to 2 letters a year maximum. The longest conversations he holds are with the guards that bring him his food, and these are over in seconds. He's lived in the same tiny cell for years, and with a life sentence, he will most likely remain there until the day he dies. For most people, that scenario sounds nightmarish, and some part of their humanity still cries out for at least some basic compassion for someone sentenced to life in prison. Keep them locked up by all means, but is it really necessary to keep them imprisoned in such a tiny cell for the rest of their lives? Now, we want you to think about that man again, and ask yourself, what if that man was a terrorist? Would your feelings on his basic rights and treatment change at all? The hypothetical scenario we've been having you think about is not hypothetical at all, but rather a reality for dozens of inmates held at H Unit in Colorado's federal Supermax prison. These inmates range from drug lords to major gang leaders and terrorists, and include domestic Christian as well as Muslim radicals. Al-Qaeda operatives live next door to white supremacists who have planned massive acts of violence against minority communities and been caught the same as their Islamic terrorist counterparts. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, this is where the federal government sends the most dangerous men in America. For these men, they live life inside a prison that is itself within a prison. Forbidden from contact with the general population, they instead spend 23 hours a day locked up in their tiny cells. Described by a former warden as a clean version of hell, civil rights attorneys have argued that it was more accurately a dirty version of hell. That's because for years the federal government also kept its most psychotic prisoners locked up here, where they mutilated themselves, talked to ghosts, and lived in feces-smeared isolation cells for months at a time. Even for the non-psychotic prisoners though, H Unit is hell on earth. These individuals are subject to what are known as Special Administrative Measures, or SAMs, measures which govern the rights of prisoners who are deemed to pose a serious ongoing threat to public safety and national security. On top of their extreme isolation, SAM prisoners are not allowed any contact with the outside world whatsoever, aside from a very carefully selected and screened number of contacts that typically only include close family members and their attorneys. This is because of the fear that a prisoner may communicate via code to criminal or terrorist organizations around the world. In fact, one such case happened in 2005, when 3 prisoners wrote letters to suspected terrorists in Europe exhorting jihad. The prisoners denied that their letters were anything more than generic personal communications, but the FBI considered the incident a serious security lapse. Now, the people a prisoner under SAM restrictions are allowed to contact is severely limited, and the individual on the receiving end of a letter has to be vetted by federal law enforcement officials before being approved for contact. That makes for a rather short list of people that a SAM prisoner may be able to communicate with, and even then their letters are thoroughly screened and censored, a process which can take months. Replies are also screened just as thoroughly, adding months on the way back. As one prisoner noted, he simply gave up writing letters to his mother, as it would take 3 months for her to receive it and 3 months for him to receive a reply. These prisoners are afforded very limited phone calls, and the ones they are allowed to place are extremely restricted and very closely monitored by FBI and Bureau of Prisons, who listen to every word. Even then, phone privileges are very few and far between, which makes keeping up with the lives of loved ones practically impossible. Until only recently, SAM prisoners were not allowed to watch news broadcasts at all, for fear that modern-day events might inflame some radical thoughts and behavior. Of what limited television time a prisoner may have, which is afforded only to SAM inmates who have earned Tier 3 privileges after years of good behavior, channels are often simply blacked out. Things such as newspapers and magazines are on a 30-day delay, and political articles are ripped out of the magazines before being given to prisoners. Day-to-day life involves their tiny 75-square-foot cell where they stay for 23 hours a day. While they're supposed to be allowed 1 hour of outside recreation per day, often this doesn't happen if the short-handed staff is too busy or if they simply don't feel like allowing the prisoner out. When they do get to experience their 1 hour of rec, they must do so in a metal cage that is approximately 4 paces wide and 8 paces long, or about twice the size of their cell. Often prisoners can enjoy a basketball hoop and a deflated soccer or basketball. Still, for men who have spent a decade or more being locked up alone in a tiny cell, just being outdoors again is a reward enough. H-Unit prisoners do not have their own shower as most solitary units do, and instead they are escorted to a shower several days each week. However, this too can be disrupted by lockdowns or staffing issues. One prisoner, Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalab, otherwise known as the failed underwear bomber, explained what his life inside H-Unit was like recently. He claimed that prison staff harassed him for his religion and did their best to disrupt his practice of it. He says that he was given no access to a halal diet, and corrections officers would often mock him and desecrate both his Quran and prayer rug. He also says that he was subjected to humiliating strip searches in front of female staff, something deeply offensive for devout Muslims. If the list of abuses sounds familiar, it's because many of these same abuses were being regularly carried out on prisoners in the infamous Abu Ghraib prison by U.S. service members. Abdul-Muttalab was also forbidden from praying with others in his religion's mandatory group prayers, and he had little if any access to the contracted imam. While he used to be housed in a regular super-maximum security prison, once he was moved to H Unit, contact with many of his friends and relatives with which he'd been allowed to correspond for years was cut off, including with his own sister. Books he ordered from Amazon to help him pass the time were also rejected without reason. Curiously, one such rejected book was The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, the Japanese art of decluttering and organizing. Abdul-Muttalib's treatment is hardly unique, and a recent complaint filed in federal court states that Mr. Abdul-Muttalib experiences life in H Unit at ADX as a struggle to avoid becoming mentally ill. The stories of other prisoners brought to life by the federal complaint paint a picture of life at H Unit as a slow journey into oblivion, a relentless whittling away of family ties, memories, hopes, and even a sense of self. Nidal Ayad, another inmate, says that if he had heard some of the stories of what happens inside H Unit 5 years ago, he would have thought that they were crazy. But now he tells of prisoners so deeply disturbed by their years of isolation that they warn him to turn off his cell's light because it emits harmful radiation. These prisoners live inside dark cells day and night, and some even claim that hot water is poisonous and harmful. Clearly, the mental stress of living in isolation has created a host of psychological problems for these individuals. It can be easy to disregard these complaints and simply write off H Unit's inmates as nothing more than the scum of humanity, who deserve exactly what they're getting. And with some of the world's most dangerous drug lords, gang leaders, and terrorists locked up inside, it's tempting to agree with the sentiment. Yet the conditions inside H Unit speak loudly about our own values. But we shouldn't let the hatred and violence of others compromise our own values and the nation we strive to be. Justice must be served and evil must be punished. But how we do these things speaks more about who we really are as a society than our laws do. All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. If you saw part 1 of the show, you'll have heard those words. They were spoken by a doctor who entered a prison in the USA loaded with chemicals to test on humans. Imagine that. You've been punished, are serving time, and then you're punished again because someone has been given the green light to use your skin as a testing surface. Much of the time when such prisoners are used in testing, they agree to do it. But often in the past, what they weren't told is exactly what was being tested and the possible dangers involved. Let's now have a look at how this was done. It's ancient history. We're gonna start with a man that's sometimes called the father of anatomy. That's a compliment, of course, but his ways could have been said to have been rather unethical. We're talking about a Greek physician called Herophilus of Chalcedon. We're told that this physician did occasionally use dead people for his work in understanding the human anatomy, but that didn't always happen. The website ResearchGate tells us that in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, looking under the hood of dead folks was plain taboo, but this physician did do it and educated Greece on anatomy like no one had done before. But he also performed what are called live vivisections, which basically means opening up a person while they're well and truly aware of it. A Greek encyclopedist known as Celsus wrote in a 2nd century medical book that Herophilus used around 600 live prisoners for his research. His work was groundbreaking, as we said, and he was a gift to medical science. But as one scientific paper asks, was he a butcher or an innovator? In this paper, Celsus is quoted as saying, Herophilus and Erasistatrus did this in the best way by far. When they laid open men whilst alive, criminals received out of prison from the kings, and whilst these were still breathing, observed parts which beforehand nature had concealed. According to that thesis, this was a kind of execution, but still one that many people at the time thought was very cruel. No kidding. Radiation experiments. If you read the book The Plutonium Files, you can find many examples of when the USA tested dangerous levels of plutonium on American citizens. The US and other countries were trying to develop the atomic bomb, and no one was exactly sure what high levels of radiation would do to a person. Some of these people were patients in hospitals, and some were prisoners. Sometimes they were just sick children, and on one occasion, pregnant women were chosen. In Massachusetts, it's said that 57 kids, many who were mentally retarded, were given oatmeal poisoned with radioactive tracers, and that was conducted by MIT and sponsored by the Quaker Oats Company. This was well after the development of the atomic bomb, and it was all about proving the nutrients in the oatmeal. It sounds like fake news, but it's not. The Smithsonian wrote that these boys were already maltreated and so seen as kids that didn't matter, adding, as part of the study, the boys were fed oatmeal and milk laced with radioactive iron and calcium. In another experiment, scientists directly injected the boys with radioactive calcium. These kids weren't exactly prisoners, but they were in the care of the authorities and didn't have any say in the matter. That same article mentions a few instances when mentally handicapped kids, kids in institutions, minorities were tested on and given all kinds of ailments. Back to radiation. In all, you can read about hundreds, maybe thousands of people that were made very sick as American scientists tried to figure out how the body dealt with radiation. All these experiments remained top secret until the 90s, when President Bill Clinton said, "It's time we talked about radiation experiment cover-ups." The plague in the Philippines. During the Second World War, the Japanese were trying to figure out how to drop diseases on the USA. But before this time, the US was trying to figure out how to treat major diseases. It's said that while in the Philippines, the US Army along with scientists purposely gave 5 prisoners the bubonic plague and caused something called beriberi in another 29 prisoners. 4 of these people died. According to the book, When Doctors Kill, Who, Why, and How, they did this not to try and spread disease, but just to better understand it. That book also says that one particular Harvard professor over there gave other Filipino prisoners cholera. The book says all became very sick and 13 people died. Thankfully, these experiments were investigated and they were called highly unethical. In the book, it's also written that during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors who had done a lot of awful stuff themselves tried to justify their work by using the American scientists in the Philippines as an example of similar malpractice. Torture. We should say here that we haven't purposefully picked out the USA, and no doubt awful experiments have been done elsewhere. It's just that there's a lot of literature available on what the USA has done. We can take torture for example, and as you probably know, many prisoners in the US have been given mind-altering drugs that has had very negative consequences. One of the most famous experiments was at Holmesburg Prison, and it took place with 320 inmates from 1964 to 1968. This is the same prison where that doctor talked about acres of skin. Prisoners there were also subjects for radiation experiments, but the torture experiment we're talking about involved incredibly powerful hallucinogens. The scientists wanted to know how much they could give a person, so they were completely useless. They tested hundreds of people. One person later said of this prison that had become well known for human guinea pigs. He had a dozen or 2 experiments going on at one time. He turned Holmesburg into the Kmart of human experimentation. It was a real industry. He was talking about the head doctor there. The doctor later told the press that he did everything according to what was asked of him and followed protocol. Even before the place became a giant lab, it was terrible. In 1938, a bunch of prisoners on hunger strike were sent to what were called bake ovens for punishment. It said 4 prisoners roasted to death. But you don't have to go that far back to see how prisoners have been used so the CIA can figure out the effects of torture. When the CIA just a few years back had prisoners holed up at black sites, it wasn't just torturing people to get information. According to a paper written by the Physicians for Human Rights, waterboarding and sleep deprivation and all manner of other tortures were merely tested on prisoners to see how they might best work. How else would they know? They needed living, breathing subjects, and human rights didn't seem to be an issue. Companies were brought in to what the report says was to calibrate the level of pain experienced by detainees during interrogation. The CIA denied this, and the government didn't investigate the matter. Then in 2010, the authorities wanted to know just how effective its active denial system was. This is a powerful laser that can hit a person's body, say people in a riot or a protest, and heat them up. It was first made, though, for war. It was decided that prisoners at Pitchess Detention Center in Los Angeles could be the guinea pigs for the laser. The ray is said to cause intense heat and pain, but when taken off the body, everything goes back to normal. It's also said, though, that there's potential for death, and there might even be some terrible long-term effects, such as eye damage if it gets you there, or even more of a chance of developing cancer. We should add that while this prison took the laser as an experimental trial, it did that to use on people only if they got out of hand. Mutants. Welcome Dr. Carl Heller. This man's experiments were said by one person to have a bit of the Buchenwald touch, meaning they were not unlike some of the Nazi experiments on humans in concentration camps, but this happened in the US. According to Gizmodo, he did the experiments on behalf of the Atomic Energy Commission. He basically radiated the prisoners, but to the extreme. Yeah, that's right. And he told these prisoners from Oregon and Washington that he had to sterilize them after the radiation so they would not contaminate the world with kids. But what he really said was that he was preventing them from passing on what he called radiation-induced mutants. He did in fact sterilize them, but a few of those guys later sued the government. The experiments went on from 1963 to 1973, and each got around $5 for losing the ability to make children, and also got blasted with radiation. There were other similar experiments performed on mostly poor black people, but they were often people suffering from cancer, so not prisoners. What would happen is they would sign up for a trial in which doctors said they were testing radiation and it might cure them of their cancer. This was a lie. What was actually happening is the US government was trying to see what happens to the body when hit by extremely high levels of radiation, far higher than anyone would receive now from radiation therapy. Cow blood. The rejection of the blood was catastrophic. This is what one scientific paper says about this particular study, in which 64 Massachusetts prisoners were injected with cow blood in 1942 after the US Navy had asked for it. Why, oh why, you might be thinking right now. Well, all in the name of science. The same as when 400 inmates at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois were injected with malaria, and the same year 200 female prisoners were given viral hepatitis, or prisoners injected with cancer cells without their consent in the 50s by the renowned oncologist Chester Milton Southam, or as one book says, the long list of prisoners given potentially fatal diseases in the USA in those days. As for the cow's blood, we're told that a Harvard University scientist was asked by the Navy to create a powerful biological weapon. Well, one source says this, but another says it was to purify the process of extracting album from blood plasma in order to make better drugs. It's actually quite hard to find information about this, but some sources say the catastrophic events we mentioned ended with the death of 64 prisoners. We found another paper that said this: 2 prisoners at the Norfolk County Jail died of serum sickness induced by the infusions of crystalline bovine albumin. Harvard medical students were admitted to the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital and bled until they went into shock. Whatever the case, everyone agrees on catastrophic. If we extended this show to include more experiments performed on minorities, poor kids, mentally handicapped kids, sick people, pregnant women, mentally ill people, we could have gone on and on.
Day of the escape. He takes a pencil from behind his ear and underlines a passage in his prison-issue Bible, Genesis 9:5-6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. He doesn't yet know it, but these words are going to come back to haunt him. All he's known in his life is violence. From being a young victim to adult perpetrator, he's killed and he'll kill again if anyone tries to get in the way of his escape. He and his accomplice, a man no stranger to extreme violence himself, will do something that's unheard of in the annals of American incarceration. Shawshank Redemption has nothing on these guys. Tomorrow, June 6, 2015 at 5:17 a.m., both of these men will be discovered missing from their cells at New York State's Clinton Correctional Facility. This is a huge complex of sprawling buildings first opened in the mid-1800s that once served as a notorious insane asylum. Among the criminal fraternity, it's sometimes called Little Siberia, due to the freezing winters and the fact it's surrounded by miles and miles of rugged wilderness. A good place to get lost if you're a criminal, but a harsh place to try to survive. The authorities will find a cheeky note left for them, a slap in the face if there ever was one. Down a tunnel, another note reads, "You left me no choice but to grow old and die in here. I had to do something." On a picture of Tony Soprano that the escapee has painted himself, he's written, "Time to go, kid, 6/5/15." No one was supposed to be able to escape from this maximum security fortress. No one ever has escaped. The authorities can't believe what they're seeing. They now know that they've underestimated these 2 uneducated felons, cold-hearted killers as cunning and vengeful as Greek gods. Millions of dollars will be spent trying to catch them, but suffice to say they ain't intending to live behind bars again. They're armed and dangerous, and they're heading to the border. Their names are David Sweat and Richard Matt, and this is the story of their truly outstanding escape. This is how it all starts. Day 1. Matt and Sweat have just started working together in one of the prison tailor workshops. Around 400 guys in Clinton make inmate clothes and other tailored stuff, such as lab coats and sweatshirts. They get 25 to 50 cents an hour. It's not much, but the job passes the time. Matt is known throughout the prison as Hacksaw. He's both respected and feared. feared because of the fact that he got his nickname from dismembering a man, respected because he'd do it again, but warn you first. Weeks 1 through 6. Outside of crime, these two men have another skill, the art of flirtation, and as luck would have it, the object of their flirtation is a civilian female supervisor who loves the attention of the men she supervises. Her name is Joyce Tilly Mitchell. She isn't exactly easy on the eye, and she knows it, which makes her vulnerable to all the guys she's supposed to watch over. On top of this, her relationship with her husband lacks any sort of passion. He's Lyle, and he's a bright star in the story of lies and deception. He's a good person in a tale full of bad people. He'll get a hit put on his head from a place that he least expects. When Sweat and Matt flirt with Mitchell, she can't help but giggle and blush. The first to really go after her is Sweat, who occasionally flashes naughty winks and smiles at her as he's sewing his clothes together on his machine. It should be said that Mitchell has been accused before of improper conduct with inmates, including Sweat, but as you'll see, she's really good at getting away with things. This is why she's fine with flirting with Sweat again, only this time she'll take things much further. Sweat has the instructor's job and Matt a regular machinist's job. Good friends, their machines are side by side. All day they plan and conspire and stare over at Mitchell. Both these guys have been designated as a central monitoring case, meaning great care should be taken to watch them. Sweat falls into this category just because of the sheer brutality of his crime. The reason Matt is monitored is that he's an escape risk as well as a brute. He's escaped from another prison in the past. A document relating to him reads, "All necessary precautions should be taken whenever it's required to move the inmate outside the facility regardless of the reason." So despite having some very sketchy backgrounds and not having great prison records, they are allowed to work in the tailor shop. Lately, they've had quite a good run in terms of staying out of trouble, so both have a cell on what's called the honor block. Here, there are 180 prisoners and 174 cells. Security is just the same here, or should be, but the inmates are at least allowed to wear some civilian clothes, have much more time to hang out with other inmates in the recreational areas, as well as getting a bunch of other privileges. This will all help Sweat and Matt. Sweat's described by another inmate as being very self-sufficient in all ways. He's clever and he's resourceful. He's even a bit of a survivalist. Matt is the chatty one, described as sociable and gregarious. He's also tough and can back up his fierce reputation if need be. He's a survivor, but far from being a survivalist. He's in his late 40s and Sweat's in his early 30s. It's Matt who introduces Sweat to one of the wonders of painting, a hobby they'll both employ as a means to escape, and one in which Matt shows considerable talent. Weeks 12 through 17. It's now plain to see for the other inmates in the workshop that Sweat and Mitchell have got something going on. It becomes more obvious when, after a while, she starts going to the stock room with him. Mitchell comes out looking all flustered and red in the cheeks. The inmates know exactly what's going on, but one of the guards in the workshop's more interested in reading his book than watching out for inmate-supervisor relationships. Weeks 18 to 25. She gets reported for treating the inmates like friends and being way too close to some of them. Mitchell fires back, complaining that she feels she's being harassed for no reason. She then files a grievance, and to be honest, the prison doesn't want the hassle, so she keeps up her job. Let's now introduce another main character to the story. He's Correction Officer Eugene Palmer, a man who's been at Clinton for 27 years. He's the go-to guard for inmates when they have a problem, and he and Matt are described as being two peas in a pod. They've been close, too close, for years now. If Sweat's working on Mitchell during the day, then Matt has Palmer in the palm of his hand on the honor block. It's ideal for the pair. It makes life easy, but at the start, they don't realize it also provides a means to escape. Matt often gives his paintings to Palmer, who's impressed with the artwork. He's especially impressed when Matt gives him paintings and sketches of his own family and house, which he does on a few occasions over the years, and he works really hard at completing them. The better the work, the more favors come Matt's way. When Palmer starts dating Clinton Correctional Officer Mary Lamar, he even commissions Matt to do a bunch of paintings of Lamar's family. One day she starts crying outside Matt's cell when he gives her the finished piece. She can't believe how amazing it is. Palmer is made up. He's made this woman happy and he owes Matt big time. Matt also informs Palmer when violence is about to happen. One day they both walk into a quiet corner and Matt warns, "You're going to lose your prison. It's a powder keg. It's about to explode." My informant tells me that when it goes, they're going to show no mercy. For this, both Matt and Sweat enjoy the best conditions in the block, receiving TVs from Palmer and as many painting supplies as they want, in spite of the fact that a paintbrush can be used for all kinds of wicked purposes. But more importantly, when Palmer escorts these guys back to the block from the workshop, he sometimes takes them away in which they don't have to pass through any metal detectors. This is foolhardy to say the least, especially when you find out what kinds of things Mitchell is giving them in the workshop. Weeks 26 through 29. Things are about to change. The prison authorities receive an anonymous letter. It states Sweat and the workshop supervisor Mitchell are having inappropriate relations, and it's damn obvious to everyone. In the storeroom, says the letter, the two bang like beavers. The complaint even says that Mitchell is always doing favors for the white guys, but she's always on the backs of Latinos and blacks. Further down, the letter states it's funny that she goes to the next door with the same guy once or twice a week for 3 to 5 minutes and comes out with nothing. I've noticed that since I started working here in the past 5 months. In short, Mitchell is furious and denies everything, but in the end, Sweat gets 30 days on the punishment block without privileges and is taken out of the workshop for security concerns. That's when he's told he'll be moving into a cell away from his buddy Matt. He loses his place on the honor block and now has no way of making money. This will play a big part in his wanting to escape. Mitchell's outrage and the tsunami of complaints she sends to the warden go a long way to help keeping her job. The prison doesn't dare bring charges against her knowing that she'll kick up a stink about harassing a female. But she's more upset about losing the love of her life. She even cries in front of some of the other inmates. She's lost the man she believes really understands her, cares for her, and she's also lost the best damn machinist she's ever had. Suffice to say, things go really downhill in the workshop after Sweat is gone. Weeks 30 to 51. Matt asks Palmer to help make him the workshop supervisor, and Palmer does it. Now Mitchell's special little helper is Sweat's best friend, and if any other inmates complain, he'll get them thrown out of the workshop. She's also quite attracted to Matt, who, it has to be said, has a way with women. He makes me feel special, Mitchell secretly tells one of her friends. He just understands me. I still haven't gotten over David, but there's just something about Richard. I don't know. He just listens. Matt is by far the better manipulator, even if it's Sweat that has a high IQ. In no time at all, Mitchell is breaking all the rules for him. One time buying him a $9 pair of reading glasses on eBay. This is about as big a transgression as you can get, but for the time being, their relationship is not sexual. For her efforts, Matt paints her a picture of her son, an 11 by 16-inch work that she's overjoyed with. Such a thing isn't easy to pass to someone in prison, so Palmer takes it from Matt, then drops it off in Mitchell's car. Since Palmer has all those years behind him, no one at the gate asks him what's in the package he now has that he didn't come in with. This is how lax things are. Week 52. Matt tells Mitchell he really needs a pair of gloves as his hands are hurting when he works out. Can she buy him some, he asks, telling her he's only too happy to paint something else for her. She says. Can you do dogs? Sure, Matt says. Dogs aren't a problem. Week 53. Mitchell breaks the rules even more times, once calling Matt's daughter for him and passing on a message. It's at this point that Matt is thinking this love-struck woman will do absolutely anything for him. Meanwhile, even her husband Lyle knows she's been helping Matt and receiving these paintings in return. Lyle tells her one night, "This ain't worth losing your job over, darling. They're nice paintings, but this could get you in serious trouble. He can snitch on Palmer if he wants, but there's one thing you don't do in prison, and that's tell on someone even if you're a guard." Weeks 54 to 55. Mitchell keeps smuggling stuff in, including 70 containers of black and cayenne pepper, 10 10-ounce packages of Cafe Bustelo coffee, several decks of playing cards, and numerous other prohibited items. It's at this point that Sweat's busy brain gets going. Still irked about losing his cushy job, one day he turns to Matt and says, "I just want to get out of this place. I want to be free. I want to go live somewhere away from everybody." He then says, if Mitchell will get you anything, why not ask her to bring stuff in we can use to escape? He says the gloves and the glasses will already come in handy, but they can do even better than that. "We have the ideal situation right now," he tells Matt. "Do you think she'll be up for it?" Matt laughs and says, "She's freaking nuts. She'll bring us whatever she wants. Just tell me what you need and I'll get her to bring it in." Sweat envisions getting through his cell door by exploiting a vulnerability in the locking system, and then walking to the yard where he'll use his new tools to get a rope over the wall. He tells Matt he needs a star-headed screw bit and some putty, and later Mitchell doesn't let him down. Matt tells her these things are for his art and the frames he'll make. Week 56 through 59. Sweat changes his mind and says to Matt, "What about getting through the sewer system?" He says for this they'll have to be in cells next to each other. He explains that they'll saw through the wall, get into the tunnels he thinks are back there. Matt asks for another favor from Palmer. Can he help get Sweat back into the tailor shop? Not necessarily his tailor shop, but any of them. If this happens, it'll mean Sweat gets a cell back in the honor block. Palmer does as he's asked, and stage 1 of the plan is complete. Week 60. Sweat is now working in the workshop 8. Matt is working not too far away in another shop. Mitchell occasionally now sees Sweat as they pass each other in the corridor. Each time she smiles and surreptitiously gives his hand a little squeeze. This mother and wife, who's old enough to be his mother, is acting like a love-struck teenager. For the time being, she had no idea about any escape plan, but she's more than willing to bring stuff in for Sweat and Matt. Week 61. Sweat is now in cell A623, right next to Matt in cell A622. He was assigned another cell on the block, but has paid the guy in A623 $100 worth of smokes and given him some homemade pornography books. Sweat says to Matt, "We need saws, hacksaw blades, that's what you need Tilly to bring in, as many as possible." 5 hours later, Mitchell is at a Walmart store close to her house, handing over $6 for a bunch of hacksaw blades. She uses cash even though she's already used her credit card to buy other items. The next day, she places them at the side of Matt's workstation. Back in the cells, Matt gives 3 of them to Sweat. It's time to do some sawing. During the evening, they both use the blades to start cutting a 10 by 10 inch hole through the 3/16 inch thick rear steel wall. As handles for the blades, they use rubber bands wrapped around cloth. To prevent any noise when they move the heavy table away from the wall, they put tape under the table legs. The sound of the sawing is also obscured, much thanks to the general din of a prison and the fact that every evening guys slam dominoes down on tables. They've sawn their first tiny hole. Success! There are air vents and attached ducts behind the wall, which will also have to be sawn through in time. The little bits of filings will be picked up by magnets the guys have stolen from the workshop. Weeks 64 through 65. They do this every day from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. when most of the other prisoners are in the mess hall or the recreation area. The officers are never suspicious. Sweat and Matt rarely eat in the mess hall, and during the evenings it's quite normal for them to paint in their cells. They only ever cut one at a time for 10 to 20 minutes, while the other uses a mirror to look down the landing for approaching guards. If a guard is seen, both men jump into their beds and pretend to be asleep or look like they're painting or listening to music. One day, Palmer almost catches them, but he's just come by to give them some more prison hooch, of which Matt drinks a ton. It takes Sweat 3 weeks to cut a hole that's 17 inches by 12.5 inches. For Matt, an 18.5 by 14.5 inch is complete in 4 weeks. The older, bigger man is always lagging behind, which in time to come will be a matter of life and death. Week 66. When Sweat's able to crawl through his hole, he starts leaving a dummy in his bed, so if the guards walk past his cell, they'll think he's sleeping. The dummy is hardly a work of art, and if those guards just paid any attention, they'd likely see it for what it was: a pair of stuffed pants and a prison-issue sweatshirt. Once Sweat's through a hole, he clips a painting against the outside with magnets he's stolen. Now he's free to explore. Week 67. One day, when he returns after his adventure, he tells Matt that he feels like a ninja. What freedom he has during these nights. But what he doesn't know is the hidden complexities of a giant prison. One night, Sweat manages to descend down 3 tiers. There he finds himself in a place that's littered with objects that have been thrown away over the years. Cigarette butts, bits of paper, styrofoam cups, and plastic bottles. After a bit of a walkabout, he gets to B block, just below the laundry building. This is progress. To get from B block to C block, he has to crawl through a steel pipe, and that pipe is blocked by a steel brace. Cutting this will not be easy at all. Even if he can, he's not sure if the heavyset Matt will be able to squeeze through the pipe. Luckily for them, Sweat has found a measuring tape on his nightly walks, so he can now measure the pipe and also Matt. Matt will be able to get through the pipe, but it won't be easy. Weeks 68 through 70. It takes Sweat 2 days to saw through the brace, only to become somewhat discouraged not to find the sewer system but some old boards in front of a great big cement wall. This is now turning into a mission of intense labor, but it's that or getting old in prison. He spends the next few nights shuffling around the subterranean maze of passageways under blocks C, D, and E, but he keeps hitting more cement walls. At least he's got tools and a nightlight, but he has to be careful. He's so close to the catwalk. Up above, he can see the guards walking around. One night, a discarded cigarette butt hits his head, and when he looks up, he sees a pair of officer's shoes. Just one wrong move and he's done. Sweat is so tired from these nightly jaunts that he never gets enough sleep. Each night after head count at 11:30, he leaves his cell, and he doesn't get back until 5:30 a.m. That's how much work he's doing, and he can hardly just sleep during the day. He has to work, and if he tries to sleep, someone will get suspicious. He looks so ragged that an officer remarks that Sweat's appearance has changed. "My God, what the hell's happened to him?" the officer tells another officer. "He looks as if he's been wrung through a knothole. He's so frail and exhausted." That's true. Sweat has lost 30 pounds since he started this exploration. Still, he is now fit as a fiddle, and this will bode well for him in the near future when he's on the run and has to turn into a veritable Iron Man. Week 71. Sweat now admits to himself that the only way to freedom is to take apart one of those cement walls. He starts removing 3 or 4 bricks a night out of the wall that is just 3 layers thick. He's basically dismantling a prison from the inside, which is why the authorities will be astounded in the time to come. As luck will have it, one day Sweat opens a contractor's gang box in a tunnel under E Block, and inside is a gift from God, a sledgehammer. This won't be the last time he gets so lucky that he'll start thinking he has angels on his side. Let's just say here that he doesn't think he deserved to get such a long prison sentence. He thinks the sledgehammer is his good karma. Weeks 72 through 74. He has to do the wall smashing ever so delicately, only striking the bricks whenever the pipes start to moan and scream. Within 2 weeks, he's breached the wall. This is it. Now he's close to the outside. or at least he thinks he is. After winding through yet more tunnels, he comes across the biggest obstacle yet. That's a 7-foot-thick son of a gun in the shape of a perimeter wall of the entire prison. At least he knows this is the last thing he has to get through. It's impossible. The wall's a huge block of cement that can only be knocked down with a machine. Even Matt joins him down there for a couple days when he's just too exhausted to do the work by himself. Matt's highly impressed with all the work Sweat's done. He looks at him and says, "Man, I can't believe you've done this. I've given up weeks ago." Matt's seen everything in his life. He's a career criminal who got involved seriously with crime at a young age. Later in life, a cop once described him as being the most vicious, evil person I've ever come across in 38 years as a police officer. Matt escaped from a care home for children when he was 12 by riding away on a horse. He stayed alone in the forest for 2 weeks. Even with his crazy existence of his, he thinks Sweat's tunnels are on another level. Still, Sweat cannot get through the wall. No amount of bashing with a sledgehammer will work. Now he has another idea. There's a steam pipe. Why not crawl through that? It's another tight space at just 24 inches and it's hot as hell, but Sweat thinks it's doable. Normally, you wouldn't be able to crawl through hot steam, but it's now May and the prison has just turned off its heating system. It'll still be warm in there and it's 20 feet long, but it can be done. Weeks 73 through 75. He struggles with the pipe, but after buying an extension cord from the prison commissary and rigging up some more lights, he knows he can take his time. He then returns to that gang box of tools, and inside is a power drill, a hammer, an angle grinder, battery packs, more lights, and even some masks for all the dust. Again, he puts this down to karma and the wrongs of America's justice system. He still needs more tools, so he tells Matt to tell Mitchell to buy 2 chisels, a steel punch, and some bits for the drill. Stuff they say they need for picture frames and other handiwork. This won't be easy to sneak in, but then Matt gets the idea for Mitchell to hide the bits in ground beef and then freeze the meat. If anyone asks, she'll say it's for the guys to make burgers. If anyone complains, well, that's harassment. She tells Matt she feels guilty about what she's been doing to her husband Lyle, as Lyle's arranging a surprise anniversary gift for her. One of Matt's paintings. She tries her hardest to stay out of his way. She now has a new word for Lyle, calling him a glitch in her life. Week 76. It's at this point that Matt tells her that he and Sweat are going to escape. That's why they've been asking for so many things. Sweat will be upset about Matt doing this, but Matt knows Mitchell won't breathe a word about it. She's attracted to Matt, but she hasn't given up on loving Sweat. Now she thinks if these guys leave, I've lost everything. She won't tell on them, but them going is something she doesn't want to think about. Matt can sense this, and for the first time he starts to get nervous. What if she does lose her cool and blabs? He talks to Sweat about it and they come up with an idea. Weeks 77 and 78. Matt puts his arm around Mitchell's waist when they're in the storeroom and he whispers in her ear, "Why don't you come with us?" He tells her she can finally be rid of that useless husband and he and Sweat will take care of her. This manipulation goes a step further when Matt and Sweat agree that Sweat needs to confess his undying love for Mitchell. Matt starts passing her letters that Sweat has written, notes that talk about how much she misses her, and signs off with XOXOXO. "I want to feel myself inside of you," he writes, while he and Matt laugh out loud. And after this, she starts bringing in so many tools, Sweat's pipe cutting gets easier. In one letter, he writes, "I love you. Can't wait to get you in my arms and make love to you." Then at the bottom he writes, "P.S. I need some more of those drill bits, XOXOXO. All these notes are destroyed after reading, just as Matt's told her to do. Week 79. But Matt feels she still needs to be worked on more. One day he finds an opportunity to move things along when they're both together in a room next to Tailor Shop 9. Matt says he needs a machine part, but he doesn't really. He grabs her out of the blue and kisses her. For a moment she's taken aback, but man is this guy strong. And he's so attractive. Still, she thinks, does he have to be so forceful? "You can love 2 people, you know," Matt says. "We both love you." This is a man with extreme violence toward women in his criminal history. His sweet words are tinged with so much darkness. Almost immediately it's arranged that she'll be the getaway driver once they're on the outside. And she'll have the car and she'll have food and money. As she's lying in bed with Lyle, ignoring his entreaties to have sex, she sees the 3 of them with a motorbike rental business somewhere on the coast of Mexico. The next day she goes out to buy some new underwear, sexier than her usual stuff. Poor Lyle thinks it's for him. Week 80. The inmates notice that Mitchell starts dressing nicer and suddenly she's losing lots of weight and doing her hair differently. During her lunch break she reads her new book, Madrigal's Magic Key to Spanish. What they don't know is that at home she's taking photos of herself naked and later handing them to Matt, so both he and Sweat can utilize them while they're alone in their cells. She's living a fantasy. Her photos are burned and certainly not used to facilitate orgasm. Matt tells her to buy black cargo pants for the escape. On the honor block, you have to wear prison-issue pants, even though you can have civilian tops. He tells her to get a tent, some sleeping bags, fishing poles, and a hatchet. "Oh," he says, "we'll also need one rifle, one shotgun, and a load of ammunition." Off she goes to the hardware store and later to the gas station to pick up a map of the local area and beyond. Matt and Sweat decide that at first, after escaping, they'll drive a few hours and rent a cabin up in the mountains in Vermont. Matt and Mitchell will pretend to be husband and wife, and Sweat will be the nephew. This plan changes pretty quickly after Matt says he has connections with the Mexican drug cartels, so if they get to Mexico, they'll have a safe place to hide before they head to the beach and start their new business. The plan suits everyone, but more so Matt, who has a tattoo on his body saying, "Mexico forever." Week 81. Sweat tells Mitchell via a note handed to Matt that they should go scuba diving together once they're there, which almost brings tears to her eyes. As much as she's attracted to Matt, her future fantasy is with Sweat only. When that happens, Sweat will have already changed his name to James Tuttle, and Matt will be Tony Goya. That's the plan anyway. It's about this time that Matt makes a strange request. He asks Mitchell to smuggle in a bottle of Bacardi 151 and a bottle of Wild Turkey. Let's just say that Matt has had alcohol problems in the past, and as you'll soon find out, booze is going to play a big part in what happens to him. She does as is told, but draws the line when he asks her for a handgun, a micro knife, and a cell phone. You might now be wondering, what about Mitchell's ever-faithful husband? He adores his wife. He would chop off his right hand to keep her safe. Will she not miss him one bit? One day, Matt asks her about him, to which she replies with a snarl, "Oh, pop my husband. He's worth more to me dead than he is alive." She means it too. She tells the guys that on the night they leave, they should go to her house and shoot her husband dead with the gun she's bought for them. She's done with him. He's boring. He's a creep. And God knows she can't stand sharing a bed with him. She looks at Matt in all seriousness, as if she's thought about this a lot in the night, and says, "Or I'll drug him until he's passed out, and then we'll take the car and drive him off a cliff. At least that won't look like murder," she says. Even Matt, with his dark past, is thinking this woman is cold. Matt agrees, and Sweat also agrees, but they're both playing her. Still, Matt goes to the prison hospital and gets some pain medication for a nerve pain he has. He later passes them on to Mitchell and tells him to keep him in her purse until the big night. Week 82. It's almost time, and Sweat is just about done with the steam pipe. It's thick and it breaks a lot of blades, but 2 pounds of hamburger meat stuffed with blades saves the day again. Mitchell does the stuffing, but Palmer is the one who takes it out of the freezer and walks it to the block without going through the metal detectors. He has no idea what's in the meat though. The heat is now killing Sweat as he tries to cut the exit hole in the other end of the pipe. He again puts his brilliant mind into action and makes a ventilation system using the fan, a bunch of plastic bags, and a t-shirt. He fastens all the bags together to make a tube and connects them with rubber bands to the fan. And hey presto, he can now stay in the pipe for hours at a time. Week 84. Sweat pushes out the last bit of pipe. On the other side, he walks for a while until he sees a manhole. He then cuts the chain it's locked with using his hacksaw blades and pushes it out. It's his first taste of freedom in years. Looking over the street, he sees the local school, and boy does he grin a wide grin. He knows he's at the intersection of Barker Street and Box Street, and he knows the guards in the towers can't see this area. It's 4 in the morning and he thinks, right then man, I could just go now and have 90 minutes until they do morning roll call. But he puts an end to that thought and remembers he must stick to his word and get Matt out too. His loyalty might just be his downfall. When he gets back to his cell, even though he doesn't smoke, he lights a cigarette and uses a mirror to show Matt what he's doing. Matt whispers back, "Are you serious? Are you kidding me? You made it through?" Sweat takes a drag and replies, "No dude, I made it out twice, and I came back." They decide they'll go in the night. Sweat writes one last letter to Mitchell and it says, "Tonight's the night. Meet us at midnight. Park your car at the manhole in the intersection of Barker Street and Box Street. Leave it running, but turn off the headlights. Get out of the car and pretend you're on the phone. That way if anyone sees you, they won't become suspicious. See you soon, my love. XOXOXO. P.S. I can already see us swimming with manta rays." She doesn't know what a manta ray is, but it sounds exotic. The question is, can they rely on her? Sweat doesn't know that she's been stressed of late. A few days ago, there was a big fight in the prison and it looked like there'd be a full lockdown. This always gets to people, but there was also an incident in the workshop when a new officer turned up and actually did his job, meaning he told Mitchell not to get too close to the prisoners, especially Matt. She huffed and puffed and slammed a few doors, and she did wonder if the prison was somehow onto her. It got worse when the officer told her to get away from Matt's workstation even though she told him there was no work to do right then. This was harassment. She shouted at him, "Leave my freaking inmates alone. If they don't have any freaking work, they can't do no work now, can they?" The officer shot back, "Ma'am, I'm security. We can't be having this in the shop." What a bully, she thought. How dare he? She kept quiet, though knowing that any more trouble could get in the way of the guys escaping. She couldn't sleep for a few nights after that. Week 85. The last time she got to talk with Matt, he tells her, "If you're not there, we're dead. They're going to kill us, you understand? They're going to kill us." She nods her head like a chastised child. June 5th, 2015. Hour 1, the day of the escape. The inmates on the honor block are surprised when Matt gives away his color TV. In the next cell, Sweat puts all his things together in a guitar case. Clothes, new boots, 20 packs of peanuts, 40 granola bars, and 12 sticks of pepperoni. He doesn't know it yet, but they're going to need that food in a big way. Hour 23. The two leave through their holes. They follow the tunnels and are on their way. Sweat leaves a smiley face note and another one with a picture of an alien. "Are you trying me, punk?" he's written on the picture. It's stuck to a metal surface with a stolen magnet. Another kick in the teeth for the authorities. When they arrive at the steam pipe, Sweat enters and makes it through easily. Matt gets stuck, so Sweat has to throw a sheet and drag him out. When Matt comes out of the other end, his pants are down. Sweat smiles and says, "Oh, Matt, I didn't know you cared." It's 11:50, a bit too early, but they get out through the manhole anyway and wait on the road. Under his breath, Sweat says, "Shawshank ain't got nothing on me." It's true. This is better than any Shawshank escape. It's the greatest escape in U.S. prison history, but it's not over yet. Sweat knows that they don't look too sketchy standing there in the street, even if they are wearing prison-issue pants. They have a guitar case, and let's face it, who escapes from prison with a guitar? They're just two guys who have been out playing with their band. Hour 24. Things then take a turn for the worse. Matt sees a car coming down the street and he bolts into someone's garden. Sweat just stands there thinking, why the hell's he running? The driver sees Matt, gets out of his car and shouts, "Hey, what are you freaking scumbags doing in my yard?" Sweat replies, "Oh man, I'm sorry, I apologize. We were just cutting through, we were on the wrong street." Thankfully, the guy seems to believe him even though there's a prison just up the street. The guitar case must have worked. This guy will later tell the cops, who escapes with a guitar case? But Matt is wired as hell and every time he thinks he hears a car, he bolts again. This is making Sweat very anxious. "Rick," he says, "just act normal. We are normal. We're civilians." Matt has issues, mental health issues. And inside the prison, that hasn't always been obvious to Sweat. Now that they're on the outside, he sees the desperation in Matt. He knows he'll strike first and ask questions later, if anyone should even look like they're getting in the way. 24 hours, 50 minutes. Why does Mitchell fail to turn up? And who exactly are these two convicts now free to do what they want on the outside? They both curse under their breaths. Unbelievable. She backed out. This is what love means to her, thinks Matt, who's offended even though he'd gladly cut her head off with a blunt knife. Where is she? What's happened? Earlier that day, at 3:30 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell clock off from work and head home, stopping for something to eat on the way. In her purse are those pills. She's panicking, and all through dinner she can't eat a thing. Lyle sits opposite, as always, concerned about her. "Are you okay, Tilly?" he says. She ignores him, as she always does. When they're home, she says she feels strange. It's a feeling she's never had before. She's dizzy. Her heart is beating faster. Something's wrong. What's happening to me, she thinks. It's a panic attack. The first one she's ever had in her life. Lyle tells her to sleep it off, but when she wakes about 9 p.m., it's starting to happen again. Lyle then drives her to the ER, where the guys are waiting on the street. At midnight, she's in the hospital. At 2 a.m., she tells Lyle, "You go home. I'll be okay here by myself." In her mind, when he goes home, he's going to meet with two men with a history of violence. She believes they're going to kill Lyle because that's the plan. They'll then take the car and drive away. The next morning, she's surprised when Lyle turns up at the hospital and says he's taking her home. He gives her a big hug and she looks over his shoulder, wondering what the hell's going on. Now, we must explain something. Two men are on the loose and they will not go back to prison, never mind what it takes to stay out. You need to know why they're in prison in the first place. Both of them had horrid upbringings, but Matt's was arguably worse. He was in and out of foster homes as a child, and when he did see his family, it was often in an environment of extreme violence. By the time he was a teenager, he was already stealing cars, taking drugs, and beating people up, including women. He escaped from the children's home, and later he escaped from jail. One time in jail, he agreed to kill another inmate's wife and children, for a price, of course. That inmate turned out to be an informant, but if that plan had gone through, Matt could have murdered innocent people. On December 3rd, 1997, Matt and another guy turned up the house of William Rickerson, Matt's former employee. Rickerson ran a food brokerage firm and Matt knew he always kept lots of cash. It was a cash business with hefty takings. Matt needed some money, wanting to head to Canada where his stripper girlfriend was waiting. The guy, getting on in age, had always liked Matt and tried to help him any way he could. It was this trust that helped Matt get into his house. He punched his frail body as soon as he walked through the door and then started looking for the cash. Matt grew angrier when he couldn't find any, tying Rickerson's hands and feet and beating him around the face. They then kidnapped him and shoved him in the trunk of their car. They stopped the car on the highway and opened the trunk. Matt punched Rickerson, stabbed him in the leg, and demanded to know where the money was. The old guy said he had no money. He'd never had a safe or anything like that. After 27 hours of intermittent torture, Matt started to believe him. There was no money. But now Rickerson would go and tell the cops, and Matt would end up back in prison. Looking at Rickerson covered in blood and bruises, Matt slammed the trunk. The next time he opened it, he strangled him. He pulled the dead body out of the trunk at the side of the road and covered it with sticks. Later, Matt returned to the scene of the crime with a hacksaw, did the dismembering, and threw bits into the Niagara River. He then fled to Mexico, where he later stabbed an American engineer while they were both in a bathroom. The guy died, and Matt got away with only a few bucks. The Mexican cops later arrested Matt, and in 2007 the Mexican government extradited him back to the US. A report said he'd been a difficult prisoner and had tried to escape, getting shot at a few times doing so. The Mexicans didn't want him. No one wanted to be near him. Even his own former attorney in the US said Rick Matt was fun, but dangerous guy to hang around with. In court, Matt heard his parole was up in 2032 when, if he survived, he'd be an old man. God, he hated prison. When a detective who'd known Matt all his life heard that he had escaped from prison, he said it's not a good feeling to know he's out there. Anything's possible with Rick Matt. Sweat was not anywhere close to Matt in terms of danger, but he too had a troubled youth, not afraid of using violence. He was always known as the brains of the operation when he and others committed burglaries. But he also got caught and, like Matt, did some time in prison early in life. Then on June 4, 2002, he and two other guys were on their way trying to deliver some firearms they'd stolen when a young sheriff's deputy pulled them over. This man had a wife and two young children at home. A guy sleeping in his house nearby heard 3 pops, which startled him from his sleep. Soon after, he heard a car screeching. He put on some clothes and went to see what was up. He found the young cop lying in the park on the tarmac, his body horribly twisted from being run down by a car. As he lay on the floor, the car had reversed over him, and he still wasn't dead though. He pleaded for his life and cried out that he had kids at home, and then one of the guys fired 2 bullets into his face. Sweat later admitted in court that he had fired the first shots at the officer, but not the 2 that hit him in the face. He said he only fired back because the officer pulled a gun on him first. Sweat hit him once, but it was just a nick. The court heard that after that, the driver reversed over him. Sweat got out and said, I'm sorry, only for the other kid to fire those bullets. The family of the victim wanted Sweat and his friends executed, but after a guilty plea, he got life behind bars. He always felt bad about what had happened that night, but he also believed he didn't deserve to grow old in prison. His friends were crazy, not him. Sweat's sentence was life without parole, so the thought of escaping never left his mind. Day 2 after the escape. Mitchell is under suspicion soon after police find the tunnel and talk to prison officers and other inmates. Sweat and Matt are covering as many miles as possible, sticking to the woods. Everyone's after them: the cops, the U.S. Marshals, the FBI, the border cops, and the Rangers. A $75,000 reward is on their backs, and people are told to approach with great caution. I have no idea, says Mitchell, when the state cops ask her if she knows where Matt and Sweat might be. They don't know she's involved, but they have a good idea she is. The prison staff have already talked about all her close relationships with the pair and her habit of taking things in for them. She pretends to be as shocked as anyone, saying at one point, how the hell did they get out of Clinton Correctional? Because I've never heard anybody getting out of here. That's why how did they even escape out of here? She is as bad an actress as she is a wife. The next day she cracks up a little bit, saying, okay, I might have brought some stuff in for them, but I never knew what they were up to. She certainly doesn't admit to planning to go with them and have her husband killed. But as time goes on, she folds. She admits most of the story, but not everything. The only ones who know the full story are the ones on the run. On June 12th, Mitchell is arrested on a felony charge of promoting prison contraband and misdemeanor criminal facilitation. Little by little, over many hours of interviews, she talks more and more about what really happened. Days 4 through 10. Even with hundreds of people looking for them and bloodhounds scouring the local forests, the pair managed to evade the authorities. It's believed they're heading to Canada, but it could be Mexico, or they could just be staying put. No one really knows. What is actually happening is they have found a cabin in the woods, and it looks like it's not being used for a long time. There, they get some needed rest and some food, and they even find a 20-gauge shotgun. Sweat thinks again the angels must be watching over him. He's vindicated in this respect again when he goes to the bathroom and finds a loaded pistol hidden above the door. They find something else too, but at this, Sweat is not impressed. There's a big stash of booze that Matt soon starts swigging down in enormous quantities. Sweat's trying to get them to freedom, and it's as if Matt doesn't care. He's getting wasted like a teenager who's found the key to the family booze cabinet. Matt says he needs it. They've walked and run around 30 miles already. Both have blisters on their feet and cuts and bruises on their bodies. When Sweat reprimands him, the much larger Matt gives him a look that says, I've killed people for less. Know your place, little guy. But again, Sweat realizes that Matt is very unstable, and he's certainly not the type of man you want to fight. He doesn't dare say anything when Matt refuses to stop drinking the next day or even turn off the TV he's always watching. Day 11 and 12. They can't stay in the cabin forever, so they head off. Now though, Matt's half-baked and he can't keep up. When Sweat loses his temper, again there's a threat of violence. Matt still has the shotgun, and Sweat has the pistol. It's around this time that Palmer's charged with a bunch of felony crimes all related to the things he's done for the guys. He will resign from his job, spend 6 months in jail, and pay $5,000 in fines. Day 20. They're both waiting at the side of the road when Matt says he's going to hold up a car with a rifle. Bad idea, thinks Sweat. He pleads with him not to do it. It will attract unnecessary attention, and he also knows that Matt will not think twice about killing someone. That's not what Sweat wants. Nonetheless, Matt waits in the woods close to the road with his gun, still drunk. Sweat shakes his head. They'll never work, he thinks. And so he runs, and he runs, and he runs, and he runs. They've already covered 50 miles, but Sweat has the energy of an athlete after doing what he did under the prison. As he's taking off, a car has seen Matt and reported him to the cops. Soon, a U.S. Border Patrol supervisory agent is on the scene. Matt won't run, and he won't go back to prison. He stumbles forward with a gun and takes a bullet from the agent's M4 rifle. As the agent walks toward the body, he can smell booze from yards away. Matt's blood alcohol level is 0.18, a classification that comes with the word mentally impaired. In his final moments, he might just remember those lines in the Bible: "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed." Day 22. Sweat has been running for so long. He's exhausted, but now within 1.5 miles of the US-Canada border. He can almost taste freedom, but then when crossing a hayfield, his luck finally runs out. He's spotted by a state trooper who just so happens to be a firearms instructor. Sweat runs and the officer shouts at him to stop while aiming his gun. He doesn't stop, and a second later he's lying on the ground having taken bullets to the shoulder and arm from a .45 caliber Glock 37 pistol. Sweat's grim future. He will survive, and in time he'll end up in special housing units in the maximum security 5 Points Correctional Facility. This is the place where he'll write up a very cogent escape plan and try to trade it with the prison. "This is how someone can escape," he'll tell the warden. "Now I've told you that, can I please see my new girlfriend?" That didn't work out for him, and he was moved to another prison. In 2022, he went on a hunger strike against the terrible conditions he was kept in. A judge ruled that the state could force feed him after being restrained, and drug him if necessary. That's what you get for embarrassing the powers that be and costing the state $23 million. Sweat remains in prison today, and he'll be fully locked down for years to come. Years after the escape, the lovebirds. Lastly, what about Mrs. Mitchell and her dear husband Lyle? She has always denied wanting her husband killed, but the evidence shows otherwise. An official 142-page report states, despite her claims to the contrary, Mitchell took steps consistent with plans to murder Lyle Mitchell. The report states she admitted she took pills from Matt, but in one interview she said she'd forgotten about them, and in a separate interview she said she had flushed him down the toilet. One time she said she's never even been given any pills. That's not what Sweat said, and it's his version of events where we get much of the other story. Mr. Mitchell has always stood by his wife's side despite the criticism he's taken for it. In an interview he said, "Do I still love her? Yes. Am I mad? Yes. All I want is for my wife to be coming home. She would never have gone through with it. That's what she told me, and that she really loved me." Now that's a dedicated husband, or an abused one lacking in confidence. Mitchell was sentenced to 2 1/3 to 7 years in state prison. The report states she was ordered to pay restitution of $79,841 and a 10% surcharge to the state for costs relating to the repair of the walls in Matt and Sweat's cells and pipes and walls in the tunnels. She got out in 2020, soon after she found herself getting takeout food with Lyle. It was just like the old days. In the truck, she looked at Lyle and his familiar buck-tooth smile. The glitch wasn't so bad. A quiet life wasn't so awful. Prison, the final frontier for some folks, and a very bad gap year for others. What happens inside those prison walls often stays within those walls, but the horrors and harsh facts do creep out from time to time. We sent our intrepid team of researchers to find out the craziest things that have happened and are happening inside prisons, and what they came back with blew our minds. Welcome to the insane world of the penitentiary. Number 50. It's a fact that anyone who goes to prison has a higher chance of dying than people on the outside. A 50% higher chance. And think about it for a second. Aren't there more ways to die on the outside? Maybe, but prisoners in some lockups face mistreatment by guards and the wrath of other inmates on a daily basis. There are also the issues of poor nutrition, not great healthcare packages, stress, and depression. 49. It's well known that the USA locks up more people per capita than any other country. But did you know that in 2019, a staggering 2.3 million Americans were doing time? Over a fifth of the entire world's prison population is in the USA. 48. Some other countries also seem to enjoy putting a lot of people in prison. After the US, next on the list for most prisoners per 100,000 is El Salvador. After that country comes Turkmenistan. 47. An investigation in 2014 found that the portions of food were so small at Gordon County Jail in Calhoun, Georgia, that some prisoners resorted to eating toothpaste. 46. He's a sadist to some and a savior to others. But one thing's for sure, and that's the fact that Sheriff Joe Arpaio is proud of how little to eat he gives his prisoners in Arizona. He gleefully wrote in his biography that his 15 to 40-cent prisoner meals were the cheapest meals in America. 45. We can tell you that this one blew us away, and that's the fact that there are more jails in the US than there are colleges. 44. In 2013 in California, around 10,000 people were released early, but not for good behavior. They were let out because prisons in the state were overcrowded. But here's the punchline. Some people doing time for violent offenses came out when folks convicted of non-violent drug offenses went in. 43. Those people serving time for non-violent drug offenses make up about half of the US's federal prison population. Those offenses are the reason the prison population has quadrupled since the early 1980s. 42. Brazilian prisons were getting so full, the country said, enough's enough. Let's come up with a way to reduce the number of people doing time. The government introduced the Redemption Through Reading program, which meant that prisoners could get up to 48 days off their sentence if they read a book. We know what you're thinking, that lots of prisoners could just cheat and skim the book. Well, that wasn't possible because each prisoner had to write a comprehensive book report. This initiative worked in two ways, because the books were giving the prisoners an education as well as an early release date. 41. An American guy named Richard Lee McNair escaped prison a whopping 3 times, and he got pretty creative about how he did it. In 2006, he actually got into a crate and mailed himself out of prison. It didn't end well for this guy since he's now doing time in the maximum security facility ADX Florence. 40. The Aryan Brotherhood gang in the US is bloodthirsty, to say the least. At one point, they were responsible for something like 18 to 25% of homicides that took place inside federal prisons. This gang was founded back in 1964 by a bunch of Irish-American bikers, and right now there are about 20,000 of them serving time in prisons. 39. In 1971, a guy named Joel Kaplan was sitting in cell 10 of the Santa Maria Acatitla prison in Mexico City when a helicopter noisily landed in the prison yard. The guards thought some dignitary from the government had come to visit, but Joel knew better. Some guys came out of the helicopter, collected Joel, and then flew him out of the prison. The story gets much weirder since after Joel made his way back to the USA, he claimed that what he had done was entirely legal. He said no one got hurt and even the helicopter was paid for and met FAA standards. The Mexican authorities might have disagreed with that, but they never asked for extradition. 38. Oklahoma can be proud of being the prison capital of the world. In this state, there are 1,079 prisoners for every 100,000 people. That might not mean much to you, so consider the fact that in the country of Germany, there are 78 people locked up in every 100,000. 37. Here's the very sad story about a man named Jonathan Magby. When he was just 4 years old, he was hit by a car, and after that he was paralyzed from the neck down. Since he couldn't use his body, a nurse had to care for him, and she basically was at his side each and every day. But get this, Jonathan smoked weed now and again because that helped with his condition. The cops didn't much like that, and when Jonathan was 27, he was jailed for 10 days for marijuana possession. If that's not bad enough, his carers told officials that this guy needed constant care, and he needed a ventilator, which he didn't get while he was behind bars. The awful end of the story is that Jonathan died on his 4th day in jail. By serving and protecting him, they killed him. Yeah, we're guessing that you think we haven't found more insane stories than that. Well, you'd be wrong. It's gonna get worse. 36. There's a woman in Thailand who holds the record for being sentenced to the most time for a female criminal. Her name is Chamoy Tipiaso, and after being found guilty of ripping off thousands of Thais in a pyramid scheme, she was handed down 141,078 years. You might wonder, is there any chance this woman could do the time? Well, it turns out that she only ended up serving 8 of those years. 35. Here at the Infographic Show, we'd like nothing more than to tell you stories about the infamous Alcatraz prison, The Rock, as it was fondly known. Back in the day, when The Rock was the home of the likes of Al Capone and other criminals the US didn't want to escape, the prison had a policy to give every prisoner the availability of hot showers. Wow, you might be thinking, how humanitarian of the authorities. Well, a bleeding heart is not the reason those prisoners got hot, steamy showers. The reasoning was that if they enjoyed the hot water showers, they'd more easily freeze to death if they tried to escape and swam in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. 34. There once was a man named Troy Leon Gregg, and he committed the heinous crime of murdering 2 people. He was eventually arrested for that and told that he was going to get the death penalty. Fast forward to 1980 in death row at Georgia State Prison. On a warm July night, Troy and some other guys made American history when they escaped from death row. The thing is, Troy's freedom didn't last long. One of the things he did on his first night was to go to a bar, but there he got into a fight with a biker and was beaten to death. As for those other escapees, they were all eventually caught and sent back to prison. 33.
In 2019, the Netherlands was having a problem that the US hadn't experienced for a long time. That was the fact that the crime rate was so low, it had to start closing down lots of its prisons. 32. In 1992, there was a riot at Carandiru Penitentiary in Brazil after a fight in a soccer game got out of hand. The military police were called because the 15 guards had no chance of controlling the more than 2,000 prisoners. What happened next has simply been called a massacre, and that's because those cops just started shooting anyone they saw, even if the prisoners were surrendering. This resulted in the death of 111 prisoners, and not even one injury to a cop. In 2013, for their actions that day, 23 of those cops were sentenced to a total of 156 years. 31. This is the story about an esteemed cancer doctor named Chester Milton Southam. Much of Chester's life was concerned with finding a cure for this terrible disease, but you could say this man might have skipped some of his ethics classes. That's because old Chester injected cancer cells into prisoners at Ohio Penitentiary. Did he get the prisoners' consent before he did this, you might wonder? Well, the short answer is, like hell he did. Don't worry, his ethics or lack thereof were later criticized. 30. We'll stick with this Ohio prison and tell you that in 1930, a terrible fire raged through the building, and you can only imagine the terror of that happening when you're locked in a cell. The guards didn't even unlock the doors. Those guys were so fearful of what might happen to them. There's both a happy and a sad ending to this story, because even though 322 inmates died in the fire, many more escaped after some inmates overpowered the guards and started running around opening doors. 29. We just know you're gonna think we're making things up now, but we can assure you that this is 100% the truth. In Canada, they have a polar bear jail. Yeah, you heard that right. When those great beasts start causing trouble up in Churchill, Manitoba, they get sent to the polar bear holding facility. The bears do anything from 2 to 30 days behind bars, and then get relocated to the wild. If you're thinking that no bears actually serve time, then think again, because lately, the 20-cell facility had to add on another 8 cells. The polar bear crime rate has skyrocketed of late because of what you might call poverty in their natural environment. 28. The Louisiana State Penitentiary has sometimes been called the Alcatraz of the South, and even worse, the bloodiest prison in America. Back in the day, it was a hellhole, and that's no exaggeration. At one point, 1 in every 10 prisoners had a stab wound, and if a knife didn't get them, the harsh work would. Things got so bad in the 1950s that 31 inmates completely slashed their Achilles tendons just to bring some attention to the injustices they were suffering. We'd like to tell you that things got better, although just recently the place has been in headlines for its corrupt guards. 27. When Hurricane Katrina happened, you'd think that prisoners in New Orleans would have been taken from their cells. That's what should have happened. But in actuality, hundreds of prisoners were left up to their necks in water in their cells without food or water. The inmates were eventually evacuated after a few days, but they let it be known that when things got bad, the correctional officers just left the facility. 26. In the 1980s, a British drug smuggler, David Macmillan, almost escaped from Melbourne's high-security Pentridge prison by helicopter. But that plan didn't exactly work out for him. You just can't hold a bad man down. And years later, Macmillan would find himself locked up in Thailand's notorious Klong Prim Central Prison. Things were looking bad for the smuggler, and he knew he had to get out. But how do you do that when not one person has ever escaped from that place? Well, this guy had one thing on his side, and that's the fact that he was very smart. He became the first man ever to escape that prison. And you know what he credits for his successful escape? An umbrella. That's right, he said later he walked off with an umbrella simply for the fact that escapees don't carry umbrellas. 25. There's a place sometimes called the most notorious medieval prison in the world, and that was the Clink. This English prison was opened in 1144, and you might say doing time there wasn't a walk in the park. Some prisoners got 24 hours a day solitary confinement and a diet that consisted of bread and water. Quite a few of them experienced that and then could look forward to being burned at the stake. 24. If you think you've seen some bad overcrowding in prisons, then you have to see the leaked security footage that came from a jail in Thailand in 2019. We can't tell you exactly how many guys are in there in that cell, but it could be something like 80 or even 100. The only way you could get more people in that cell would be if you started piling the bodies on top of each other. 23. In the 1800s, a British man was sent to Australia on a transport ship to serve time on a penal colony. There he got the name of Moondine Joe. He turned to crime again, committing robberies and then hiding out in the bush. And for that, the authorities hated him. His luck ran out when he was caught, and this time the authorities made sure he wasn't going to escape. He had to serve his sentence in a nice pair of leg irons, but Moondine Joe still managed to escape. His plan now was to walk through that bushland and virtually cross Australia, but the cops once again got their man.
Okay, so they had him, and this time he definitely wasn't going to escape because the warden had built a cell especially for Joe. It was basically a concrete box. So how could Joe get out of that? The local governor even said to him, "If you get out again, I'll forgive you." Guess what? He got out. Joe made a hole in one of the walls and off he went into the sunset. After that, he tried not to commit any more crimes, but after a few years, he started robbing again. He was captured again, of course, but the governor was true to his word and had Joe removed from prison. 22. You could say that no one on this planet has been as adept at escaping from prison as Moondyne Joe, but that's when a Japanese man named Yoshi Shiratori steps up and says, "Hold my beer." Shiratori is famous for 4 successful prison escapes. 21. Back in the 1960s, one guy whose name you saw a lot was Timothy Leary, and that's because he became kind of a guru in the hippie counterculture. Leary believed that psychedelic drugs held powers that could help mankind, and he wanted to prove it. He got his chance when he took part in something called the Concord Prison Experiment. This involved Leary giving consenting prisoners doses of psilocybin, aka magic mushrooms. The question was, would those guys who did the mushrooms quit crime when they got out of prison? The answer was that 20% of the guys who took part in the project went back to crime after prison, while 60% of the other American criminals at the time did the same. 20. When you're doing time in Iceland's Kvíabreya prison, you can enjoy rooms with exceptional views and even get out now and again to do some shopping in the market. The rooms all have internet and the guys, not the guards, have the keys to those rooms. You might also be surprised to hear that it's a diverse kind of joint with women, men, the old and the young all mixed together and helping each other do their time. 19. In the USA, around 75% of prisoners will end up back in prison within 5 years after their release. 18. In Norway, only around 20% of released criminals will end up back in prison. 17. Not so many people know this, but Senator John McCain actually did time behind bars. The senator was flying a plane in the Vietnam War, and that plane was shot down. He ejected out of the thing, but doing so, he broke both arms and a leg. McCain was captured and then sent to Ho Lo Prison, aka the Hanoi Hilton. He was beaten, and you can imagine how that felt when he already had some bad injuries. He did eventually get some treatment, but after a few weeks, the poor guy had lost 50 pounds. If that wasn't bad enough, he later did a 2-year stretch in solitary confinement. Could it possibly get any worse, you might wonder? The answer is a resounding yes. He was interrogated a few times a week, and during those sessions, he was bound and savagely beaten. The man spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war, and because of his injuries until the day he died, he still couldn't lift his arms above his head. 16. Perhaps the worst kind of prison might be one with no doors. Yes, you heard that right. A prison you're just left to die in. This is a form of punishment called immurement, and it basically involves having a cell built around you. This happened to a Moroccan serial killer in 1906. He was walled up and screamed for days on end. Since he had no water to drink, those screams didn't last long. 15. If you've ever visited the city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia, you might have walked down a quiet back street and found a former prison. It's now called the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. Before this place was a prison used by the communist Khmer Rouge during their bloody takeover of the country, it was just a school. When the soldiers of the uprising got hold of the place, they turned it into a torture and execution center and called it Security Prison 21 or S21. Walking from room to room, you see numerous torture devices and photos of all the families that were killed there. Another room is filled with their skulls. Tuol Sleng was a prison where people were sent to be tortured and killed. Women, children, and of course men. They'd been accused of, well, not being on the right side of politics. They were just your average student, teacher, doctor, engineer, soldier, sailor. We won't talk about the horrific devices they used to torture and ultimately kill them, but needless to say, imprisonment there was worse than you can imagine. Our researchers at the infographic show have been to this place, and we can assure a visit is absolutely heartbreaking. 14. When Alcatraz was up and running as a prison, there was a rumor that the waters around the island were full of man-eating sharks. That's not exactly the truth, but it probably prevented a few men from trying to escape. A great white has been spotted there in the past, but that was very unusual. Certain kinds of sharks might swim in that water, but not the kind that will munch down on a man. We're getting close to the top 10 now, so expect to see something special. 13. Japanese prisons are well known for being really strict. An American man who was sent there in the 90s said he got 10 days in solitary just because he looked up before eating. That was a big no-no, of course. 12. What you're about to hear is possibly one of the most outrageous prison stories ever. In 2017, at an Ohio prison, an investigation revealed that some very clever inmates had made 2 computers and hid them in the ceiling.
A computer by itself wasn't very useful, but the guys connected the devices to the state's Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections network. The only reason those guys got caught was because the prison realized that daily internet usage was exceeding the threshold. The good news is that those men had obviously learned a lot in their prison electronics class. 11. What's called the most violent prison riot in American history happened in 1980 at the New Mexico State Penitentiary. In short, the prison was taken over by the prisoners, and guards and inmates were taken hostage. None of the guards were killed, but we can't say that for the captured inmates. What happened is some of the gangs that were leading the riot took over the prison. They rampaged through the cell blocks, and if they couldn't get through a door, they used a blowtorch to get through it. On the other side, there were guys who were in protective custody, and some of those people ended up being tortured, hanged, dismembered, and killed in other terrible ways. We hate to tell you this, but that blowtorch that they had was used on the faces of men deemed snitches. 33 people in the end were killed. 10. There was a special dungeon in the Tower of London called Little Ease, and the thing was, when you got sent there, you got Little Ease. That's because it was so small a person couldn't lie down. It was a tiny little box and must have driven prisoners mad. 9. In every prison, you have a guy that makes hooch. Well, you have a lot of guys that do that, and they make the alcohol drink from juice, bread, and bits of fruit, but might throw in all kinds of things. We found one guy who considered himself a hooch master when he was doing time, but one thing he got wrong one time was when he didn't burp the bottle enough. That means letting out some gas. He didn't do that, and things blew up in his face. If you ever decide to become a hooch master, then we suggest you get down with burping your brew. 8. After a study that was conducted about a giant Los Angeles jail, it was found that 800 people did 200 days in that jail before they were found innocent or guilty. 7. You might think that there's just no way you'd ever end up in jail, but listen how some people got there. Okay, so not paying a parking ticket can land you in jail, but it gets much worse than that. A few years ago, a 19-year-old man in Michigan did 3 days behind bars because he had not paid a fine for catching a fish. What? You're thinking? Well, we should tell you that he wasn't supposed to catch that kind of fish at that time of year. His crime was out-of-season fishing. We found an 82-year-old in Maryland whose beloved chihuahuas kept getting out of the house. How's an old woman supposed to keep those little things under control? She got fined, couldn't pay, and went straight to jail. She served 2 days. So don't think that you could never end up in jail. 6. In 2011, death row inmates in Texas no longer had the option to have a last meal before their execution. You might wonder why. The answer is because a senator in the state got quite upset when one prisoner ordered a massive meal and then ate none of it. The guy ordered 2 chicken fried steaks, some fried okra, about a pound of barbecue, 3 fajitas, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, a meat lover's pizza, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, and bell and jalapeno peppers, and lastly, a pint of ice cream and a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts. All of that came, and the prisoner said he no longer felt hungry. That was enough to make some officials angry, and last meals became a thing of the past. 5. In 2007, a lady named Lucille Keppen was released from a U.S. prison, and it made the news. That's because she was the oldest female in the country before her release. The 93-year-old had served 5 years for shooting her neighbor. 4. In 1926, an Australian man named Bill Wallace shot a guy because that guy started smoking near Wallace. Smoking indoors was all the norm back then, but Bill didn't really like the smell. He went to prison and never came out again. But guess how old he was when he finally passed away within those walls? The answer is 107 and 11 months. He did a total of 63 years. 3. In 2019, at a prison in Arkansas, the officers were a bit embarrassed when a prisoner just seemed to disappear. Where is the guy, they wondered. 1 minute he was there, and the next just gone. A manhunt was soon underway, and those red-faced officers took dogs into a nearby rural area, knowing the guy couldn't have gotten far. They found him in the end, but not outside of the prison. He was found hiding on the roof. 2. You won't be surprised to hear that life ain't easy for some folks on death row. They sit in solitary confinement and just wait and wait until it's time to lay down on that gurney and take that toxic potion into their veins. The waiting can cause something called death row syndrome, which basically means they go mad. One guy who said death row was like living in a submarine or a cave had his execution delayed because he was in no fit state to die. Others might start talking to themselves or even have psychotic delusions. You can sure get low on death row. And number 1. It's a rough estimate, but it's thought that 46,000 to 230,000 people in U.S. prisons are actually innocent. Since 1992, 20 people in the U.S. have been exonerated from death row because of DNA evidence. The records show that there have been 2,551 exonerations in America, and those guys in total did 22,540 years behind bars for something they didn't do. Now that might be the most insane fact we have for you. For a long time, sometimes posts what McNair says in letters on Twitter. One tweet went like this: "I've been a 10-year resident of ADX Florence, and I see a new resident is coming. El Chapo. I look forward to meeting you and sharing breakout stories." If you read that Twitter account, you'll also know why McNair always ran so well. That's because he worked out every single day when he was behind bars. Some 70,000 convicts were sent here, but very few made it out alive. With conditions harsh enough to shatter the spirits of even the most resilient criminals, this was truly a land of torment, the final destination for many unfortunate souls. Welcome to Devil's Island, the world's most notorious prison to ever be forgotten. Sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? With a treacherous landscape and an ominous past, you'd better watch your step because danger lurks in every direction. The name Devil's Island was actually coined by the prisoners themselves, which should give you some clue about the conditions that they lived in. Officially, it was called Bagna de Cayenne, otherwise known as the Penal Colony of Cayenne. Located about 9 to 10 miles off the Atlantic coast from Kourou, a small town in French Guiana on the northeastern coast of South America, resides 3 small rocky islands. These are known as the Salvation Islands, also known as the Île de Salut in French. In this case, the term salvation would seem like an oxymoron. The smallest of the 3 islands is Devil's Island, a narrow strip of land about 3,900 feet long and roughly 1,320 feet wide. Don't let the palm trees fool you. This was no island paradise. Today, an overgrown jungle is slowly hiding the remnants of what was once a penal or exile colony, a virtual hell here on Earth. Established by the Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, the island was originally used as a leper colony to quarantine people with leprosy before later being used to incarcerate political prisoners and criminals. Throughout a long stretch of time consisting of around 100 years, many were convicted here, including murderers, rapists, and those deemed as an overall threat to society. Some men, however, were sent here despite being innocent of the charges that were staged against them. It didn't matter what category of criminal you were listed under. If you were unlucky enough to be sent here, you endured the same fate as everyone else. Items on the agenda included squeezing into tight living spaces, getting covered in dirt, and being abused by other inmates. Whether you were a petty thief or a savage murderer, you could expect to be stripped of your identity and thrown into the mix. You were forced to cohabit the same environment and mingle with those more dangerous than you. Not surprisingly, fights were a regular occurrence amongst the prisoners, many of which ended in murders that later went unpunished. No one really cared whether people lived or died. Isolated on a treacherous island with no way out, why would anyone bother punishing the prisoners? It only required paperwork, a guide was quoted saying to Atlas Obscura during a visit to the island. It was easier, he explained, to let nature take its course and let them die of harsh labor, tropical disease, or a failed attempt to escape. When the prisoners were punished on rare occasions, they were commonly put in isolation for months at a time. Imagine going a long time in a dark room with no one to talk to. Some convicts were even placed in deep 12 by 12 foot holes with bars on top instead of a roof, so that they'd be subject to all kinds of weather conditions without a shelter to protect them. One prisoner was reportedly tied to a tree deep in the jungle as punishment for attempting to attack a guard. He was left to endure the elements, vulnerable to nature's wrath. The next day, he was discovered dead. Out of 70,000-something men, 3/4 of them died from disease, hunger, and mistreatment. Many also fell prey to insects such as ants, as well as bats and rats picking at their rotting bodies. Many convicts even died on the way to the island, since even the trip in and of itself was extremely dangerous. Many inmates were forced to share tiny, cramped cells with one another in filthy conditions. To put this in perspective, these cells were about the same size as the common household bathroom. As an exercise, if you were trying to squeeze your entire family into one, maybe you'd have a better idea of what it might have been like. Say goodbye to your privacy. We wouldn't recommend trying this if you're claustrophobic, though. After 1885, the population of Devil's Island greatly increased as the French government started sending more prisoners, including an influx of more convicts charged with smaller offenses, not just hardened criminals. The conditions became ever more crowded as a result. Prisoners were routinely shackled at night, their legs tied to an iron rod. With a natural desire to shift and adjust your sleeping position throughout the night, it's easy to imagine that this would have been torture. During the day, prisoners were forced to move around in chains, with starvation being common. Many resembled walking skeletons. A lot of prisoners anticipated death and probably welcomed it when it finally came. Though there is a graveyard located on the island to this day, most of the prisoners were not buried there. Due to its hazardous rocks and powerful ocean currents surrounding the island, safe access was only possible using a cable car, which crossed the 60-foot wide channel between Devil's Island and the main island, Ile Royale. Though on every prisoner's mind, escape was very difficult to achieve. Some might even say impossible. The rough landscape was its own challenge with sharp rocks and piranha-infested rivers, and sharks also posed a serious threat. These killer monsters circled the island constantly, eagerly waiting to feast on the prisoners. They were even said to respond to the ring of a bell like trained dogs whenever it was time to dispose of the corpses. The bodies of the dead convicts were on the menu, loaded into wheelbarrows and dumped into the ocean. The piranhas were basically handed a free meal on a silver platter. Many who tried to escape also perished in the water. One well-known prisoner to be brought to Devil's Island was a man named Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Born in 1859, this French army officer was the son of a wealthy Jewish family. He was accused of selling military secrets to the Germans in 1894 and was put on trial for treason. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, and he arrived at Devil's Island on April 13, 1895. His case, however, initiated a 12-year controversy known as the Dreyfus Affair, which made a lasting impact on the political and social history of the French Third Republic. During this time, the French press was highly anti-Semitic, and the evidence that had been used against him was largely fabricated. Dreyfus reportedly cried out, giving a passionate plea. He said, "I swear that I'm innocent. I remain worthy of serving the army. Long live France, long live the army." But it made no difference. Despite having pled his innocence, public opinion welcomed the verdict and wanted him to be sentenced. Dreyfus was used as symbolism for anti-Semitic propaganda, spreading popular opinion about the supposed disloyalty of French Jews. Not everyone was convinced, however, and doubt over Dreyfus's guilt spread like wildfire. The case sparked widespread public attention and split France apart into two opposing groups, those who were for his guilty sentence and those who were opposed to it. Dreyfus was eventually pardoned and released once it was realized that he was unjustly condemned, but not before spending over 4 long, brutal years on Devil's Island. Considering that more than 40% of prisoners did not survive their first year on the island, and few lived to see their release date, Dreyfus was very lucky. He was released on June 5, 1899. He had written a journal detailing his captivity in more than 1,000 letters. So how about those who managed to escape from Devil's Island prison? There are very few who succeeded, one allegedly being Clement Duval in 1901. He was an anarchist who fled to New York City and wrote a book about his imprisonment called Révolte. Another escapee was a man named René Belbenois, who escaped by helping a film company. He earned $100, which he used to bring a Chinese merchant boat to pick him up. When the boat arrived, he hid in it and sailed away. He spent months recovering with a native tribe off the mainland, making his way on foot through South America. He walked through Central America up to Mexico before finally entering the United States. Now, that's quite a hike. Belbenois published 2 books called Hell on Trial and Dry Guillotine, 15 Years Among the Living Dead, which spread awareness about what went on in the penal colony. There must have been something about the island that drove successful escapees into authorship. Why else would they want to recount their experiences by writing books about it? René Belbenois made a mistake by traveling back to his home country of France to argue his case. Upon his arrival, he was immediately captured and returned to the colony to be imprisoned once again. He was eventually released though and went on to live a free life in California, where he worked as a technical advisor for Warner Brothers during the making of the 1944 film Passage to Marseille. He also founded René's ranch store in the Lucerne Valley and later obtained legal U.S. citizenship in 1956. Perhaps the most popular and infamous escape from Devil's Island was done by Henri Charrière and Sylvain. Born in 1906, Henri Charrière was framed for murder and transported to the prison in 1930 from France. He was otherwise known as Papillon, the French word for butterfly. He earned his name due to the butterfly tattoo on his chest. During his escape, he leapt from a cliff on the island into the sea with his companion, Sylvain, using 2 sacks filled with coconuts as life buoys. It took the pair 3 days to drift to the mainland, and they somehow managed to avoid being eaten by sharks. Sylvain died shortly after reaching the shore, supposedly due to getting caught in quicksand. It must have been really aggravating for Sylvain to make it all the way across shark-infested waters for 3 days just to die that way. Henri, on the other hand, was caught and thrown into another prison, the Banya at El Dorado, but was soon released to live a free life in Venezuela from there. After his ordeal was over, Henri wrote a book, Papillon, which detailed his experiences. French authorities attempted to discredit him, denying his claim that he had escaped from Devil's Island. They even went so far as to say Henri was never sentenced there to begin with. Critics go on to say that Henri should have admitted that this book was based on fiction. We'd be curious to know whether you believe Papillon is based on fabricated accounts of events or if French authorities were just trying to cover it up. It seems pretty suspicious to say the least, especially since many aspects of the story bear more than a few similarities to a memoir by another Devil's Island prisoner called Dry Guillotine, which had been written 30 years before Papillon. Nevertheless, Henri's Papillon name continued to live on in infamy upon his death in 1973. To this day, the name Papillon can be found carved in the floor of cell 47 on Devil's Island. There were even movie adaptations made from the story. If you're looking for something to watch tonight, there are 2 different versions of the film to choose from. We went ahead and did the research for you to make your life a little easier. The ratings on Rotten Tomatoes give an 83% for the 1973 version of the movie Papillon, starring Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman. A poorer score of 52% was given for the recent 2017 version of the film. You're welcome. Though the transportation of prisoners to the French penal colony was abolished in 1938, the last of the prisoners continued to remain on Devil's Island for much longer than that. The closure of the facility was delayed upon the outbreak of World War II. Starting in 1946, French penal colonies everywhere were gradually being terminated one by one. Devil's Island, however, was the last to shut its doors in 1953. For the most part, it was largely forgotten by the rest of the world. Today, however, Devil's Island is a popular tourist destination because of its dark past and the fame it acquired from the books and film adaptations of Papillon's story. There's a sort of twisted irony in the fact that so many prisoners could not flee the island in the past, but now you can't get on the island even if you wanted to. This is because it's closed to the public. Though you cannot actually step foot on the island itself, however, you can view it offshore from a charter boat. Many also take helicopters over it just to sneak an aerial peek at the ruins. The other 2 islands in the group, the 3 Salvation Islands, are open for access to the public and contain some of the original buildings restored as museums. So what's the appeal of visiting exactly? This may be in large part due to the movies, or perhaps some people have a ghoulish sense of curiosity for the atrocities that went on there. Who knows? Like with any story involving a place with a dark past, there are some who claim Devil's Island is haunted. Visitors have said they've seen ghosts of prisoners everywhere in the crumbling ruins. If we could ask, our question for the ghosts would be, if you died wanting to escape the island in life, why spend all your time there after death? Perhaps it's a form of purgatory for those lost spirits who still can't find their way to freedom. Guantanamo Bay Naval Station is located on southeastern Cuba, a small 45-square-mile American military station on lease from Cuba since 1903. In the past, it's been an important naval station, ensuring U.S. military forces remain close to the Caribbean and its many vitally important trade routes. However, in 2002, the U.S. began construction of a detention camp where it would house suspected terrorists that it ensnared in its global war on terror. But just how secure is this facility? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're asking, is it possible to escape from Guantanamo Bay? The Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp, or Gitmo as it's commonly known, is a prison facility located on the U.S.'s Guantanamo Bay Naval Station. At the start of the U.S.'s war on terror, a need for a secure housing facility for dangerous suspected terrorists and insurgents was immediately identified by the U.S. government, and thus construction began on what would be known as Camp X-Ray, which would later be shut down as Camp Delta. A 612-unit detention center came online. Camp Delta now houses Camps 1 through 6, as well as Camp Echo, where detainees are in-processed upon arrival. For 3 years, the CIA also operated a small site known as Penny Lane, which housed special prisoners the agency tried to recruit as spies. While the rest of the facility featured pretty sparse living quarters, Penny Lane had private kitchens, showers, televisions, and beds with mattresses, all in a bid to encourage prisoners to cooperate. Nearly from the start of operations, allegations of abuse and torture leaked to the press. Condemned by the United Nations, the U.S. argued that detainees at Gitmo were not guaranteed Geneva Convention rights and protections because they had specifically chosen not to fight as regular soldiers or operate under a clear chain of command. Terrorists and guerrilla fighters, the U.S. argued, were not protected by Geneva Conventions in place to protect uniformed prisoners of war. Men whose nations chose to abide by international law should be the only ones protected by that law. If allegations of torture weren't enough, however, Soon it was revealed to the public that most of the detainees couldn't be verified to have any actual links to terror organizations, and instead had simply been combatants arrested by NATO troops. Others had their links to terror networks greatly exaggerated, though a few were indeed some of the most dangerous men in the world. Because Guantanamo hosts some of the world's most dangerous terrorists, specific information about its security features are almost impossible to ascertain. However, we asked a security expert with 6 years' experience securing priority level 1 resources for the US government how a prisoner may in fact escape. Our expert, which asked to remain anonymous, said that escape was likely impossible, but every security has key vulnerabilities that can be defeated. The trick is being able to defeat all of a security system's vulnerabilities one after the other in the limited amount of time you have for an escape attempt, something which is simply not likely. First off, you're going to have to deal with the security personnel themselves. What is known about internal security at Gitmo is that military police personnel conduct constant rounds, making visual inspections of their prisoners every 3 minutes through a window on the cell door. Then there's the locking mechanism on the door itself, which is typically behind a half inch of steel and impossible to access. Simply put, you're not going to get out of your cell unless a guard lets you out, so your best chance for escape is to get friendly with a guard. If you're a particularly handsome man, trying to woo one of the female guards, approximately 20% of Guantanamo Bay's prison staff is female, you're going to be hard-pressed to get through all the anti-terrorist indoctrination. But hey, stranger things have happened. If that's not possible though, and you somehow manage to compromise the locking mechanism on your door, our source wouldn't comment on how to do this, then you're gonna have to deal with that pesky, constantly patrolling guard, checking in on you every 3 minutes. Luckily for you though, our source states that the greatest vulnerability of any security system is always the human element. Guards become complacent, and while at the start of a shift, those 3-minute checks may come so punctually you could set your watch by them, but as the hours creep by, especially at night, 3-minute checks are going to turn into 4-minute checks, then 5 or 6-minute checks. Eventually, they may become even just hourly. Bigger security lapses have happened at facilities more sensitive than Gitmo. Complacency and time is your friend. Once you've figured out how to get out of your cell, simply wait. Be a model inmate, don't rile up the guards and lull them into a false sense of complacency. Wait for a popular holiday such as Thanksgiving or Christmas when guards will have more on their minds than just simply making some boring, repetitive rounds that they've made for months on end. That's when you make your escape. There are, however, bound to be additional security features inside the prison facility's housing units than just the door on the cell, and it's unlikely that you'll be able to defeat these without raising the alarm. One source tells us that because of its small size, Gitmo enjoys the benefits of smaller prison centers, better engineering and construction, which eliminates many of the pitfalls of larger complexes, such as the large access shafts that pierce through the heart of Alcatraz. Plus, the small size of the prison complex lets the guards enjoy a much better guard-to-prisoner ratio, which means more eyes on you than in a place with a larger population. Assuming you make it outside, however, you are almost certainly going to have to deal with several layers of security fencing. In most government facilities, video cameras ring the entire perimeter and are set up so each camera covers another's blind spot. A central alarm monitoring center will typically have 1 or 2 operators responsible for monitoring all interior and exterior alarms, and be able to instantly bring up any alarmed sector of the fence line on camera for a visual inspection. A persistent alarm, or if the camera is mysteriously down for some reason, will prompt them to send an armored patrol to make a physical sweep of the area. So how can you defeat multiple layers of alarmed fence line? Well, much the same way as you defeat the interior security, prey on human fallibility. Most secure facilities have 3 different types of sensors along their fences. The first is a Raycon microwave sensor that detects movement between the fence lines. The second is a tout wire sensor, which runs the length of the fence line and detects climbing or cutting. And the third is buried in the ground and designed to detect vibrations. That's 3 security features to overcome in the span of just a few minutes. How could you do it? Though the physical security system itself is formidable, it will always have one significant weakness: the human operators. Most security personnel will spend their entire career with 99.99% of every alarm and incident being a false alarm. This breeds a deep sense of complacency when training and professionalism dips amongst a security force. Some of the worst offenders, though, can be alarm operators themselves, whom typically spend countless hours pulling up alarms along the perimeter, which end up being nothing more than just a rabbit or mouse scurrying about. Add to that inclement weather, with winds pushing along debris and blowing on the fence line, and an alarm operator's board can light up like a Christmas tree. inevitably leading them to ignoring the majority of alarm calls for the duration of the storm, or simply accessing them and telling security personnel to conduct regular patrols through the area. Your task, therefore, is going to be to encourage an alarm operator to ignore the alarms you'll soon be setting off. This can be easily achieved, but will require greater patience and will require the help of someone on the outside. Your secret collaborator will report to the planned escape route 2 weeks before your big escape and camp out all night long outside the piece of fence line you'll be penetrating, while making sure they stay hidden from any security patrols. For 2 entire weeks, your compatriot will be tasked with setting off at least 2 of the 3 alarm systems on that piece of fence line over and over again for hours on end every single night. This can be achieved relatively easily. You can do things like attach a thin fishing line to a piece of debris, such as a small stick, and hurl it over the fences to the other side. Then tug against the fences or drag it along the ground. This will set off the alarms, but when an alarm operator pulls up the video feed, they'll only see a piece of random debris. Alternatively, you can also use the same tactic used by American infiltrators during the Cold War against the Soviet secure facilities. Purchase a large amount of mice or other rodents, and every night release several into the fence line one at a time over the course of hours. Seeing nothing but animals in the cameras after several days of this alarm, the operator will be inclined to simply begin ignoring new alarms from that sector. Repeat the procedure enough times, and chances are that the alarm operator will get sick of hearing the same alarm dozens of times night after night, and simply access it, silencing it, and ignoring it. Complacency is your greatest ally. Escaping from Guantanamo Bay is likely impossible, though, due to the physical security located inside the prison itself. Though ironically, the secure fencing is certainly the weakest element to overcome. Yet, even if you manage to make it to the outside of the prison, you'll still be amidst a U.S. naval station, and any escape will have to take into consideration the U.S. Navy's sea and air resources, to include patrol craft and helicopters. So you end up behind bars. You, the reasonable man, the cool operator, a person who doesn't need to solve problems with his fists. You're an intelligent being, not an animal. You're a lover, not a thug. But here's your prison predicament, Mr. Moderate, your penitentiary problem. Your confinement catch-22. You have to fight in this place. If you let people push you around, you're gonna get picked on. You might end up a punk. Don't fight, you'll have problems. And fight, you'll have problems too. You can't win, that's prison. This is what you tell the staff after you hit a guy back. They didn't care about this prison paradox. You got time in solitary. After the next time you defended yourself, you lost your prison job. And after the next scuffle, you were charged with assault. Welcome to the vicious cycle of the American prison system. Let's face it, in the end, everyone in prison is a loser, a punk to the system. You can try and beat that system, but it will break you in the end. A lot of people doing hard time at some point realize this, and they try to settle down, do the time, not let the time do them. But if you've seen the podcasts, read the books, watched the documentaries, you'll know that even the most intelligent and calmest types will tell you that in prison you might have to let that Homo sapien rage show at some point. Inside those prison walls, that reptilian part of the brain might have to override your fleshy reasoning machine now and again. We're not saying you can't do your time and stay out of trouble. We're not saying that you will definitely have to fight. But we are saying that it's a very real possibility. And as we said, if you don't fight back, other predators will see this as a weakness. They might later try and exploit you. That's why you'll hear a lot of former prisoners saying just hit back and lose your mind a bit. Show them that even if they beat the hell out of you, they'll have to work for it and get hurt doing so. Those predators will think twice about trying to take advantage of you after that. You don't have to be a jiu-jitsu black belt or a trained boxer to smack someone in the face, to gouge their eyes. We all have some of that violent DNA. Before we were social animals, we were warriors, each and every one of us. Ask any Neanderthal. Oh, you can't. We killed them all. With early humans, it was fight or die. In some respects, the prison system brings out the early human in people, the tribal thug, the atavistic ape man. Fight or die, like the bad old days. You can choose to be separated from other prisoners, but the isolation will hurt after a while. You can choose not to fight back, as we said, and you'll get exploited for your weakness, just like the weak member of a tribe. The prison system will make an animal out of you. Don't you ever forget that. The best thing to do is to not be there in the first place, but hey, some folks have ended up on the inside for not paying parking tickets or deciding to eat a psychedelic mushroom and be at one with nature. As we said, once inside those walls, you might be presented with the prison catch-22. Fight and get in trouble, or don't fight and get in trouble. Even if you didn't start it, you can't tell the prison staff the truth because prisoners take a dim view of informers. Rats or snitches are about as popular as chomos. You keep quiet and you get time in solitary, or at least receive some kind of punishment such as not being able to get things from the prison store, the commissary. As we said, fight again and get in more trouble even if it wasn't you that started it. Really hurt a guy that might even want to kill you and find your small sentence turning into a big one. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a play called No Exit, with the common catchphrase from that being hell is other people. And prison is about as close to this as possible in this world. You can go inside a good man and end up metamorphosizing into a person you never knew existed. The authorities know you're stuck in this paradox when you're told to be good and behave, yet the system itself denies you the possibility of doing this. But they either don't care or can't do anything about it. Rules are rules even when they make no sense. Prison is irrational. Those words should be written above every prison entrance. So there you are. This is what you can expect inside. We don't want to sound hyperbolic and say prison will present you with fights every day. Some people do indeed manage to keep their head down. Some prisons are less violent than others. But in the USA and many other countries, violence is a part of prison life. Okay, so let's now take you through a fight. Here's the scene. You've not been inside long and some guy pushes you out of the queue in the canteen. You push yourself back in. You need to eat. He then just lashes out. You have to defend this, otherwise you'll be seriously injured. What he doesn't know is that you can box. You catch him right on the chin and knock him clean out. You get back in the queue, but the guards are now onto you. We should say that in some US prisons, you might just be expected to fight right away to see what you're made of. You might hear prisoners calling this a heart check. So you've gotten into this fight. What now? If the guards didn't get there or somehow didn't see it, the guy might get picked up and be asked if he wants to go again. You might even get jumped by his friends. You might not have heard the end of it. But let's just say you've been seen by the staff. They are likely going to surround you, tell the others to stand back, tell you to get on your knees and put your hands behind your head. Usually people don't just get knocked out, and so you might have been pounding this guy for like 30 seconds or a minute. If you don't do what the prison officer says, you might get pepper spray in your eyes, which, if you've experienced that, you'll know it's rather unpleasant to say the least. Most prisons too have something called an emergency response unit. Pepper spray or not, you are bleeding and he is in a terrible state. You're now going to be escorted to the prison hospital and a nurse is going to clean you up. You'll be in restraints, of course. Something one former officer also wrote online is that it's not just the prisoners taking notes on how well you fight, how your heart stands up. But officers will be watching. New officers and prisoners will also be seeing how an officer deals with two powerful or at least enraged men. A fight inside means much more than a fight on the outside. Okay, so you've broken prison rules. You can't do this and not get punished in some way, or at least have to explain yourself. We must say here that how you be punished depends on a few things. Did cameras show that you certainly didn't start the fight? As you know, you shouldn't inform on the other guy, so you can't give all the details. As senseless as that may be, especially given you were defending yourself, it's the inmate code. That code wasn't written by sensible men. Something else you must understand is the extent of damage you've caused. If you've knocked out 3 of this guy's teeth, headbutted him so hard his nose shattered, and punched him with such ferocity you split his cheek and it had to be sewn up, well, that's a crime on the inside as it is on the outside. You can be charged with assault. You might get many more years. You're also now a dangerous man with fists like weapons. You might need to be separated from the prison population either because you're a danger to others or that dude's buddies are planning to cut your throat. The staff are going to weigh all this up. Some staff in prisons have also been known to purposefully create gladiator environments, either for the entertainment or they want someone dead. We don't think this happens often. You're going to be in solitary confinement while the prison staff are working out why this violence happened. Was it premeditated? Was it a gang attack on you? Or was it just expressive and unplanned? If you've been set on by a gang in a premeditated attack, the officers are going to have to make sure it doesn't happen again. But let's say it was what it was, just a reaction to an action in that queue. First of all, you might have to fight this guy again behind closed doors. Prisoners also know blind spots where fights take place, but you're still in solitary so you can forget about that for a while. If that guy was in a gang, which is highly likely, he might get punished for getting whooped, or you might have to tackle someone else from that gang at some point or join it or do something else. At some point soon, you'll be told what offense you've committed and maybe a likely outcome. In the UK, it's written that within 48 hours this happens. By the way, while you're in solitary, that other guy is in the prison hospital. You are uninjured. Let's say you've beaten this man to within an inch of his life. That's serious, and the prison might be put into lockdown. One process you'll have to go through is called an adjudication or hearing. If you've watched the prison shows, you'll know this means sitting in front of people and being told what you did and what's going to happen to you. You can add to this or just say, "Yes, I did that. Guilty as charged." Whether guilty or not, you are guilty because most of the time you won't claim self-defense and blame it on the other guy. Remember, prisoners don't snitch. You can also be sure that no one else saw the fight, too. Even if you've been beaten almost to death, physically abused in the worst way, some guys that quite like you won't even snitch. This is another example of the craziness of prison. You can't be good even if you want to be. This system ensures you lose every sense of your personal ethics. If you want to check if you've been treated fairly and actually broken a rule, you can head to the library where you should find a prison discipline manual. You've been found guilty and you should be given a written notice about this. In the UK, the prisoners call this a nicking sheet. It should be the same in the USA after you've had a hearing with officials or sometimes the warden. You'll be told what you've done and what's going to happen to you. It might just be that privileges are taken away from you. But you've done some damage, so as we said, you might be charged with an offense. You might have to do time in the hole. You might lose that cushy prison job. You could have your good behavior time removed, or have time added onto your sentence. The guards might decide to ransack your cell, making a huge mess and perhaps finding some contraband. You might lose some of your cherished cell items, and perhaps the worst, you might get transferred to a prison known as a hellhole full of maniacs. All because you defended yourself, and all because some moron was in a bad mood. This is real life, no exit. It's not easy to get out in one piece. Just be glad he didn't bang his head when he fell and it killed him. Then you'd likely be doing life and you only went in for selling your buddy a handful of those mushrooms. But let's change this a little and say it ended up being a minor scuffle and no one really got hurt. In that case, you might just get what's called a shot, rather like a blemish on your prison record, a little slap on the legs. Maybe it was a one-off and the staff go easy on you. But if you want something in the future, a new job, more items, your shot or shots, it will be taken into account. So there you go, a 101 of prison fighting. We might start with the positive, not for the authorities of course, and look at prison escapes that went marvelously right. We might remember one of the greatest escapes of all time, and that was because it involved 3 men breaking out of Alcatraz prison. They went missing in 1962 and still no one knows if they survived or died in the waters of San Francisco Bay. Then you have the final escape of Henri Charrier, aka Papillon, which involved sailing away on a makeshift raft. Or what about the numerous incredibly cunning escapes of the serial killer scoundrel Charles Sabrage, a man who we've talked about already at length. More recently, we saw the brazen escape of the gangster Joaquin Guzman Lorea, aka El Chapo, but like many escapees, he was recaptured. Let's now look at failed escapes. The hapless hitcher. Obviously, once you've managed to escape from jail or prison, you should be careful who you talk to, as suspicion from another might land you right back in jail. In 2018, the BBC reported that 31-year-old Alan Lewis was being taken from Greenup County Detention Center in Kentucky, USA, when he told officers that his handcuffs were too tight and were hurting him. As an officer tried to help Lewis after a short struggle, he made a run for it. Freedom at last, but the man was stuck on a highway and needed a ride. In desperation, he held out his thumb, and a kind driver stopped for him. Except the driver noticed that Lewis was trying to hide what seemed like handcuffs fastened to one wrist. It turned out that the man driving the car was a police officer himself. Lewis got a ride right back to jail. The authorities later said he thought he was getting a ride, and he did. You might call this guy a chancer, but we'll get around to some hardcore criminals who orchestrated amazing escape attempts. An explosive letter writer. This is yet another failed prison attempt in 2018. This time it involved a man called Sean Damon Castorina, and he was trying to break out of Alamace County Detention Center in Graham, North Carolina. Serving time for first-degree murder, Castorina wouldn't have been released for quite some time, so he tried to figure out how he might get out a bit faster. His cunning plan to expedite his sentence was to build an explosive and blast his way out. Well, he needed help for that, so he wrote a letter to 2 of his friends with information about how to make a bomb and which prison wall they would blast, near to where Castorina would be waiting. What could possibly go wrong? Well, he sent that letter with bomb-making information to the wrong address, and it was picked up by a regular sort of person who subsequently informed the authorities. The media later wrote, he has now been charged with 4 counts of felony conspiracy, 2 counts of manufacture or assemble a weapon of mass destruction, and 1 count of attempted escape from jail. Reading between the lines. Be careful what you say when planning a prison escape, even if you think your words are coded. In 2010, a 67-year-old prisoner at the Isle of Wight's Parkhurst prison in the UK thought he would send a message to the outside via a letter. In the letter, these words were written: "More heat, less light." It sounds innocuous, but guards that were monitoring all the prison mail became suspicious. It turned out that this former science teacher had been hatching a plot to escape from what some people have called the British version of Alcatraz. Seeing that the prisoner had written "more heat" in one letter, the guards heated up some of his correspondence. This revealed that he'd been using dried lemon juice to write down his escape plans. The heat showed he'd sketched detailed maps of the prison, while messages were conveyed using encrypted code and messages hidden in Sudoku puzzles. He was also planning to use a helicopter to pick him up in part of the prison where it could land. He was found out. Later, the prison governor said, "I am delighted at the way our security team and Hampshire Constabulary have foiled a possible escape attempt." He was then moved to another prison, but reports state that none of his accomplices were arrested. Love won't tear us apart. This one should be a Hollywood movie, if it's not already and we don't know about it. It's the story of a woman called Barbara Ann Oswald. In 1978, she hijacked a helicopter that she had chartered, except she didn't count on the pilot being an ex-Vietnam vet. She put a gun to his head and told him to head to the United States Penitentiary, Marion in Illinois. She was trying to help inmate Garrett B. Trapnell, a con man, career criminal, and air pirate. Oswald was the lover of Trapnell, and the two had planned to get married. She didn't get very far as the pilot of the helicopter wrestled the gun from her and shot her in the head. That was the end of her and the end of the escape attempt. But the plot thickened. The daughter of Oswald was convinced that Trapnell was her father. He wasn't, and she very much wanted to get him out. She was only 17 years old when she hijacked TWA Flight 541 just months after her mother had died in the attempt to get Trapnell out. The brave daughter held the 80-something passengers for hours and flew to another location with about 40 passengers. She said she had dynamite strapped to her chest, but the 3 sticks turned out to be flares. She was finally arrested. Trapnell, who had hijacked a flight himself in the past, said there was no way that the young Oswald was his daughter. He'd never even met her mother face to face. Lord couldn't keep his mouth shut. Over in Australia, 3 hardened criminals who were all serving long sentences for drug trafficking got the idea to hire an SAS soldier living in the Philippines to get them out of prison in Melbourne. Except a man called Lord Tony Monaghan got in the way. Don't let the title Lord fool you. This man had once run a brothel. He had trafficked drugs himself, and he later grassed on others to reduce his own time in prison. One of the people he grassed on was the man known as Mr. Nice, aka Howard Marks, the Oxford-educated global pot trafficker who later became a celebrity of sorts. Anyway, so our Lord told the authorities that he had learned that 3 Aussies had hired an SAS guy to land on the tennis courts of the prison in a helicopter and break them out. He also said once they were dropped off, they would be taken in a van to Sydney and they would board a yacht and sail into the sunset. None of that happened as the cops just waited for the men to wait on the tennis court and then arrested them during the escape attempt. Again, this could be a movie, and one of the guys who tried to escape had been featured in books. His name was David Macmillan, another well-to-do Brit who speaks the Queen's English, but trafficked drugs for a living. He not only became one of the world's biggest smugglers, but he is the only man ever to have escaped from Thailand's notorious Klong Prim Central Prison. He wrote a book about this called Escape, saying because conditions were so brutal in Thai prisons and the fact that he'd get death likely reduced to life, he had no choice but to get out early. The human stain. Okay, back to criminals we might not label with the epithet mastermind. In recent years, you can see that quite a few prisoners in Brazil have successfully escaped from prison by crawling into and out of the sewers. This can be a messy business, of course, but one can imagine the smell of feces can be put up with when the sweet smell of freedom is just around the corner. But back in 2016, things didn't go as planned for one fella. You can find a video of him online being pulled back out of a clogged sewer in what the media only said was a Sao Paulo prison. The video shows the captured man later standing in his cell, his skin painted brown, a coating the Telegraph newspaper called human filth. Current status: on the run. All of you out there know very well that if you were ever to successfully break out of jail or prison, then the next best thing is to probably keep your head down, right? We mean, you wouldn't post a photo on Facebook of your free face. No way. And you certainly wouldn't post a picture of your free head and not do anything about that globe icon that ensures anyone can see this picture. Well, CBS News in 2010 reported that a man called Chris Grego did just that, and he was warned by police. This one is perhaps a bit of a cheat, as Grego managed to evade cops before he was actually sentenced for assault, so it's more of an escape from law than a prison break. We just like the story. While Grego was out, he kept updating his Facebook page, and so the cops didn't have to try very hard to find him. Grego had even shown off, posting his own wanted poster on his page. One of the arresting officers told the press, "If it wasn't for criminals like him, our job would be a lot harder." Almost perfect, 9 out of 10. Sometimes we can be brilliant and occasionally we just fall at the last hurdle. That's fine, at least we got to that hurdle. But in this case, you might wonder if the guy could have pushed himself just a little bit further. His name was Robert Emery, and he was locked up at Oregon State Prison in 2010. The Oregonian newspaper tells us that this hardworking man broke windows, drilled out a door lock, broke into metal tool cages, bashed a hole in the laundry well, lugged bags of tools, dug under one fence and climbed over another. He'd also left a dummy in his cell, something we often see in movies. The media reports that he had spent time making this figure so it would look just like a real sleeping person. It had been a physically demanding night, and the news tells us that Emery wasn't just tired, but he was bleeding too. Emery, then 50 and serving time for robbery, kidnapping, and assault, after being hurt on the razor wire fence and then just decided to catch a few Z's, got under a blanket and went to sleep in the yard. Some reports, perhaps bordering on clickbait, state he fell asleep as he was just so tired. More responsible media, however, say he actually gave up as he could not scale the razor wire fence. Watch your weight. While you could argue that it isn't the worst prison in history of the world, the Tower of London evokes nightmarish pictures of bodies being torn apart on the rack, of hellish screams coming from dark chambers, of cruel leaders leaving anyone they disliked there irrespective of any crime being committed. But people escaped, and as late as the 20th century when a man picked a lock with a spoon. In the early 18th century, the Earl of Nithsdale dressed up as a woman and managed to get past guards. For that trickery, he saved his own head. In the 16th century, Jesuits John Gerard and John Arden performed the tried and tested rope over the wall thing and managed to lower themselves down to freedom. It's said that they did this with mangled hands, a punishment hors d'oeuvre before they were really hurt. But this is not a show about success, and we must tell you about Griffith ap Llewellyn, the son of a Welsh king back in the 12th and 13th centuries. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London after some disagreement with the King of England, with the latter not keeping his end of the bargain. It's said the king put Griffith up as a guest in the tower, but the Welshman wasn't keen on the idea. In 1244, he made a rope out of cloth and bits of sheets, and he tried to lower himself out of a window. His makeshift rope snapped. We're told he was a portly man, and he fell to his death. And that's all we have for you. Can you add to this list? Which one is your favorite? Tell us in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other show, Man So Violent Even Other Prisoners Fear Him. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.